Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is May 14, 2022, and this is part 3 of our COVID-19 update. In the previous two parts of this update, we focused on government policy and some other more political questions. In this part 3, which should be our last installment of the update, we're going to be focusing mostly on the biological damage that COVID causes. This is not the flu. It is an inflammatory disease that affects most of your vital organs. Of course, it affects the lungs. That is during the acute phase, the first 2 to 3 weeks, the main mechanism of death. If it causes enough inflammation and fluid accumulation in your lungs, that's usually how people die from it. It also, though, affects your brain, nervous system, heart, blood vessels, liver, kidneys, immune system, and so on. So it causes extensive damage in the body, especially if your COVID is severe enough during the acute phase that you wind up in the hospital. People who are hospitalized tend to have extensive damage and much worse health outcomes. But even if you have a mild or even asymptomatic case, you can still get long COVID and also suffer extensive inflammatory damage, as we're going to see. One of the most shocking articles that I've read for the group featured in this installment is that even a mild case of COVID during the acute phase, the first 2 to 3 weeks, can result in aging of the brain by 10 years and brain shrinkage. This is not the flu, so we'll just drive that home again. This is not the flu. So let's start out with some statistics. This is the COVID wastewater again. I showed this just a couple of days ago. However, we have updated data. So biobot.io, biobot.io/data is where you can find these charts. And what we see here is the levels of COVID-19 detected in wastewater, which is monitored across the United States. You can see clearly that obviously there's the huge Omicron spike over the January 2022 label. But we are now at the same levels of COVID in the wastewater that we had during the Delta wave in the fall, so August through November, roughly. There was a spike, looks like late September, early October, where Delta was higher than it is now. However, right now, it's basically the average level of the Delta outbreak, yet it's barely being discussed. Here it is zoomed in to just the last 6 weeks. You can see throughout the entire last 6 weeks, it's just been steadily rising. And the correction on this graph versus the last one is that the graph no longer tops out at 400, so you don't get that artificial flatlining. And you can see it's just been steadily rising at like a 30-degree angle for the last 6 weeks. And at some point, it's going to start surging. I don't know exactly what the tipping point will be, but again, we're back into the Delta levels. At some point, I don't know if it's going to be an outbreak of BA4 and BA5, subvariants of Omicron, which that's what's driving a surge currently in South Africa, or if it's going to be something else. We looked at the different variants, the different strains. The BA2.1.12.1 subvariant of the BA2, that is more aggressive, more contagious than the regular BA2. That is currently displacing BA2 in the United States. So none of this has resulted in a sharp spike. It's going up at like a 25, 30-degree angle rather than the 80-degree angle, just straight up almost, of the Omicron BA1 wave back in December and January. However, it's probably just a matter of time. Anyway, here we have a third graphic. This is the wastewater by region, and you can see that the Northeast has been leading as far as the overall prevalence, but all the other 3 regions are also rising. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the West. There was a bump, then it came back down. Then it went flat, and now it's slowly starting to rise again. I would expect that to just start rising because really there'd be no reason for it not to. And that's roughly the shape of things. So before we get into the extensive discussion that we're going to have in this video of, again, the biological damage that the COVID virus causes in the body, I want to give a shout out. You can see here a screenshot from YouTube. This is from a channel called RUN-DMC/Gez Medinger. And this channel is doing a lot of high quality COVID interviews. I've only watched a couple of them, so I can't really endorse everything on the channel. I just haven't seen it. However, what I have seen is pretty good. So if you're looking for a deeper dive into some of these subjects, I would recommend checking out this channel. Again, think critically about it. I can't endorse each individual interview. However, I was watching this one with Dr. Amy Proal. The title is The Evidence for Why Viral Persistence Might Be Causing Long COVID. And this is about as good a presentation as I've seen on the long COVID stuff generally. There's another channel that does COVID stuff, John Campbell. Really don't like that channel at all. He's done kind of too much somewhat anti-vax stuff, and he was kind of pushing the Omicron as a natural vaccine kind of line. I mean, he has a lot of viewers, and I know some of them have been in the S4A audience at times, but really, I would suggest doing better than John Campbell. Do give this channel a try. From what I've seen so far, it looks pretty good. Again, I haven't gone through it extensively, so there may be some kind of questionable stuff up there also, but let's discover it together. We'll keep checking back in on that. But from this interview with Dr. Amy Proal, they talked about 5 possible causes for the long COVID symptoms. And so long COVID doesn't have one set definition, but it's basically after the acute phase, the first few weeks, is over, the reemergence or new emergence of the same or new symptoms. So the 5 possible underlying causes include 1, dysregulated immune response. So the last time that we did a big long COVID piece was in the year-end special, so the video from December 31st. And actually, I'm not sure if it was in that video or a subsequent one, but we discussed a study that was suggesting that COVID seems to wipe out a lot of your naive T cells, which is kind of like the foundation of your immune system. It's a major part of your immune system. So dysregulated immune response may be contributing to some of the long COVID symptoms. Number 2, autoimmunity. So another sort of immune symptom, basically what is visible in some long COVID patients is that they develop an autoimmune response. So what this means is that your immune system starts attacking things in your body, like things that are part of your body that are supposed to be there. Your immune system starts to recognize as like a threat and attacks them and creates inflammation and all the things that your immune system tries to do when it is attacking what it views as hostile. So one of the articles we're going to look at on here is one about COVID toe. This is kind of a well-known symptom where people will get what looks like a rash or bruising on their toes, and this is basically inflammation in the capillaries, the small blood vessels in the extremities, and it's caused, as the article suggests, most likely by an autoimmune response causing inflammation. So basically it's completely messing up your capillaries, and that's not good. So anyway, we'll read more about that later. Number 3 is viral debris, and number 4 is viral persistence. So what this means basically is viral debris is pieces of virus that is no longer active. It's not like whole infectious virus causing, an sustained ongoing infection, but it's like pieces of spike protein or whatever else that is still present in the body, hasn't been completely broken down and disposed of yet. And in that process of kicking around in your body, it's causing an immune response and inflammation and other kinds of damage and things that you don't want to happen. Number 4, viral persistence, is similar. This is where the virus actually just does hang around in your body at low levels. And actually, we're going to look at an article about somebody was identified in the UK having the COVID infection for a full year. Like they were still testing positive after a year. So the virus can persist in the body. This has really been, kind of a mystery. Is like, again, remember, COVID is new. This is a novel virus. We haven't seen it before. And so researchers are just studying it now, and we're learning all kinds of things that it can do. There's, again, it's not the flu. It's not the common cold. There's not like an easy set of answers here. We can look back at SARS-1 from like 2003, 2004, and see if there are similarities and things like that. But this is not even the same as SARS-1. It's a new virus. So it does seem to show this ability to persist, and that can cause lasting effects in the body. Basically, you're not back to normal. The virus is still present in your body. And then kind of off of that point, number 5, reactivated latent viruses. So through complex interactions of systems in your body, the COVID infection can reactivate some of the other viruses which stay latent in the body. Now, we'll discuss this a little bit. There's going to be a section about the acute hepatitis that is occurring in children. So there's actually a name for this, COVID-associated hepatitis C. So it's CAH-C. This last C is for children. There's a rash of acute hepatitis, that's liver inflammation, that is actually resulting in some kids needing liver transplants. It's that bad. There's kind of a cover-up going on, is what it looks like. They're trying to blame adenoviruses, which are much milder viruses. They basically do cause the common cold, that kind of thing. And the thing is, they hang around in the body sometimes. So, you can recover from an illness, but your body may not kick the virus entirely. You may know, for example, like once you get chickenpox, it can resurface in the body later on as shingles. It's the exact same virus. It was in your body the whole time. It just, your immune system defeated it, but it doesn't entirely leave. It's still present. So there may be some sort of COVID, being involved in the reactivation of other viruses in the body. So these are all, basically in this video, they were talking about specifically the evidence for viral persistence as being a factor in long COVID and maybe a major factor. But really all of these, and maybe other things too, are also potential factors. So again, this is not the flu. Don't get it in your body if you can possibly avoid it. So let's get into the articles. This one's from The Guardian. The headline is, "First person to have COVID infection for more than a year identified in the UK. Researchers at London hospitals call for urgent new treatments for persistent infections." This is by Ian Sample, dated April 21st. Doctors in the UK have called for urgent new treatments to clear persistent COVID infections after identifying the first person in the world known to have harbored the virus for more than a year. The patient, who had a weakened immune system, caught the virus in 2020 and tested positive for COVID for 505 days before they died. Previously, the longest known PCR-confirmed case of COVID was a U.S. cancer survivor in her 40s who tested positive for 335 days. Researchers at King's College London and Gez St. Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust followed 9 patients with persistent COVID to see how the virus evolved over the course of their infection. All of the patients had weakened immune systems due to organ transplantation, HIV, cancer, or therapies for other illnesses. The infections typically persisted for 10 weeks or so, but 2 patients had the virus for more than a year. In addition to the patient who was infected for 505 days, a second has so far tested positive for 412 days and may exceed the 505-day record at their next follow-up appointment. Last summer, doctors in Bristol revealed that a 72-year-old patient, Dave Smith, had tested positive for nearly 10 months. Patients with weakened immune systems are particularly vulnerable to long-running COVID infections. In the latest study, 4 of the 9 patients died, with COVID contributing to perhaps a third to half of those deaths. Persistent infections may also be a source of new COVID variants because the virus acquires fresh mutations as it evolves in the patient. Quote, "These individuals seem to have a very poor outcome when they have persistent infection," said Dr. Luke Blagden-Snell, a clinical research fellow at Gez. Quote, "There's an imperative to develop better treatments to clear infections for the patient's own benefit. It may also have the added benefit of preventing the emergence of variants, but that is not yet clear." Unquote. Genetic analyses revealed that in 5 of the 9 patients, the virus acquired at least one mutation found in the variants of concern that are prone to drive major waves of disease. The virus obtained from the patient, who was infected for 505 days, carried 10 mutations that arose separately in several major variants, including alpha, gamma, and omicron. Many scientists suspect that some variants of concern, such as alpha, arose in patients with persistent infections, but other sources of new variants are possible, such as animals that contract the virus and then pass it back to humans. Snell said none of the mutated viruses found in the study's patients appeared to have spread beyond the infected individuals. One patient in the study is likely to have had a rare occult infection, meaning they tested negative on PCR for COVID despite having an ongoing infection. After falling ill with the Alpha variant in 2021, the patient's symptoms subsided and they tested negative several times, but later saw the Alpha variant bounce back and cause further symptoms, despite the variant no longer being present in the UK. The patient had not traveled outside the country. The virus may have been lurking deep in their lungs, where nose and throat swabs could not detect it, Snell said. Dr. Gaia Nebbia, a co-author of the study, said new treatment strategies, quote, are urgently needed to help patients clear persistent infections. Quote, this may also prevent the emergence of variants, she said. The work is to be presented at the European Congress of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases in Lisbon on Friday. Paul Hunter, a professor of medicine at the University of East Anglia, who was not involved in the study, said there may be some people who never clear their COVID infections. So comment, of course there are many people who never clear them, people who die from the COVID infections. I guess he means people who just live on with them. Anyway, it's an odd statement. While antiviral drugs and antibody therapies help many patients, the antibody treatments in clinics today are less effective against Omicron than previous variants. Quote, equally important would be to manage the underlying cause of the immune suppression in the hope that the person's immune system could recover, Hunter said. So that's the end of that article. This is focusing on people who have some kind of pre-existing, immune condition, or they're getting chemo or something like that. Something that may, weaken their body's defenses against COVID and cause it to hang around artificially longer. However, I think this was phrased oddly, but, this idea that some people live life for many years, but never lose the COVID virus. They never completely clear it. Again, we're just 2.5 years into this. There's a lot we don't know about COVID. So now let's open the door on the damage that COVID causes in the body. Here's an article. This is from April 25th from Forbes, written by William A. Hazeltine, who writes a lot of COVID articles, many of which are pretty technical. The title of this one is SARS-Coronavirus 2 Mimics Inflammatory Proteins in Our Body. This could explain a lot. Let's read. One of the paradoxes of SARS-Coronavirus 2 is that while it represses interferons in the innate immune system, it ignores and may even exacerbate our innate immune system's most violent form of defense, the inflammatory response. So comment there. Interferons, what are those? So interferons are part of your immune system. They are a type of chemical called a cytokine. Basically, these are signaling chemicals that, in response to a threat in your body, they are released and they stimulate parts of your immune system into action. You may have heard the term cytokine storm. This is when basically a whole flurry of cytokines get released and it actually overactivates your immune system, causing inflammatory damage. So in this case, they're talking about how COVID can repress interferons. However, it may exacerbate the inflammatory response in other ways. Let's continue. Inflammation is one of the most serious consequences of viral infection and is a hallmark of severe SARS-Coronavirus 2. When they keep saying SARS-Coronavirus 2, let's just say COVID. When COVID replication and inflammation are left unchecked, they not only lead to severe immediate consequences, but also long-term consequences. Now, recent studies show that COVID activation of the inflammatory response is not a passive process, but an active one. 2 studies published in iScience and MBio indicate that COVID actively produces a protein called ORF8, which mimics one of the most potent inflammatory response triggers, interleukin-17. So here we have a diagram of interleukin-17 stimulating an inflammatory pathway. So inflammation is not always bad. It is an important part of the acute response by your body to a threat. However, inflammation can also be very damaging to your tissue. So having too much of it at once can actually overwhelm your healthy parts of your body, and also having chronic inflammation can cause pretty major damage in your body. So you think about when you get sick and you get achy muscles and things like that. This is some of the inflammation that's being triggered as your body responds to whatever pathogen has invaded your body. That's temporary. It's okay. It's not necessarily going to cause, lasting damage. But if you have, again, chronic inflammation on like a daily basis, that can actually wind up weakening your body over time. And then also in sort of, we were talking about the cytokine storm. That's an example of acute overinflammation, which can actually, in the process of responding to the disease threat, actually, injure or even kill the host. So, continuing, interleukin 17 is a family of proteins that are produced by T helper immune cells. They are one of the principal molecules tasked with triggering the inflammatory response in the body. When interleukin 17 proteins interact with their corresponding interleukin 17 receptors on the cell membrane, a cascade of reactions is induced within the cell. This cascade of reactions leads to the activation of the transcription factor NFKB. NFKB induces several cell defenses, including inflammation. Clinical data has shown that patients with severe COVID display high levels of inflammation, leading to acute respiratory distress syndrome and multiple organ failure. So commenting, we've covered this in past videos. Basically, when you get this in your lungs, the lungs can fill with fluid, specifically the parts of your lungs where the gas exchange occurs. Like you breathe in air, and then the oxygen in the air gets picked up in your blood. Well, the actual area in your lung, very tiny parts, where the oxygen actually gets picked up by your blood, if those get inflamed and fluid is produced, then that gas exchange cannot take place. You wind up with hypoxia, too little oxygen in your body, because it literally cannot get from the inhaled air in your lungs into your blood. The fluid is in the way. So, that's a case of acute respiratory distress. Talking about multiple organ failure, again, we're going to be talking about this later with the acute pediatric hepatitis that is resulting in some people needing liver transplants. So, it can cause that much inflammation in other organs as well. The lung is just sort of the most common one. But also the kidneys can be badly damaged and you get heart inflammation, all kinds of things. Continuing. While antibodies that target interleukin 6 are commonly used to inhibit inflammation. So in other words, you have an antibody, that's something that your body produces that can kind of grab onto what's called an antigen, which is any kind of basically thing that your immune system doesn't like or treats as foreign. An antibody that can grab interleukin 6 and sort of sequester it. This is used to inhibit inflammation. Anyway, continuing. They did not seem to have the same effect in COVID patients. So they attempted to use these anti-inflammatory antibodies and didn't work. The question that remained was, how does COVID cause inflammation, and what treatments could be used to diminish it? In a study, Lin et al. Hypothesized that inflammation in COVID patients may be due to interleukin 17 rather than interleukin 6. To test their hypothesis, the researchers examined 3 different COVID proteins, NSP2, ORF7A, and ORF8, and they tested their interactions with interleukin 17 receptors. To their surprise, only ORF8 exhibited interactions with the interleukin 17 receptors. So, commenting there, basically what this is suggesting is that the ORF8 protein, this is from the COVID itself, was able to stimulate the interleukin 17 receptor, basically mimicking the interleukin 17. What does it do? Remember the graphic, it stimulates an inflammatory response. So in other words, this COVID protein is mimicking part of your immune system, the part that causes inflammation, or one of the parts that can cause inflammation. All right. These results were confirmed by in vitro experimentation. Comment, in vitro means not in a living organism, but in a test tube or something like that, and are in line with clinical data. Patients infected with COVID containing mutated ORF proteins displayed lower levels of inflammation. While this determined that ORF8 interacted with the interleukin 17 receptors, it was unclear whether ORF8 directly triggered inflammation. Comment, basically mimicking the activity of interleukin 17 directly, or if it promoted inflammation by increasing the expression of interleukin 17. In other words, not directly mimicking it, but somehow just upregulating the interleukin 17's effect on the receptor. To test this, Lin et al. Engineered cells that did not contain any interleukin 17. They then exposed the cells to ORF8. They found that the inflammatory pathway was triggered even in the absence of interleukin 17. This suggested that ORF8 could mimic interleukin 17 and interact with its receptors to directly induce an inflammatory response. So commenting basically, this COVID protein could, in the absence of any of the body's innate interleukin 17, it could mimic the interleukin 17. So basically, this COVID protein mimics one of your immune system's own pro-inflammatory chemicals. So that's what COVID is doing. It's directly having effects on the immune system that way. Lin et al. Successfully demonstrated that the interactions between ORF8 and interleukin 17 receptors caused inflammation, but how could those interactions be prevented? The researchers began by testing an interleukin 17 receptor antibody treatment. By using an antibody treatment, researchers believed that the antibodies would block the interleukin 17 receptors so that the ORF8 protein could not bind to the receptors. There's a diagram of this there. So you have the receptor on the cell, which causes the processes that receptor is connected to basically begin, and the ligand that binds to it. And then on the right, you have what they did, which is basically they made antibodies, which one of the antibodies, that orange one, binds to the receptor, so basically prevents things from attaching to the receptor. Then it looks like they made another one that bound to the ligand in this case being that ORF8 COVID protein. So, to test this theory, Lin et al. Engineered a pseudovirus that expressed the ORF8 protein. They then genetically modified mice so that the mice would no longer contain interleukin 17. Lin et al. Infected interleukin 17 deficient mice with the pseudovirus and compared inflammation levels in mice treated with receptor antibodies and mice who were left untreated. While inflammation occurred in both the treated and untreated mice, the treated mice exhibited much lower levels of inflammation than the untreated mice. This determined that interleukin 17 antibodies were an effective treatment to reduce COVID-induced inflammation. So just to recap this, these mice were not capable of innately producing interleukin 17. So as far as the inflammation pathway that the interleukin 17 basically turns on and acts as a stimulator, as a key for basically, those mice just couldn't produce that chemical, therefore their own body could not stimulate that inflammation pathway. Then some of the mice were treated with the antibodies that would block those interleukin 17 receptors. So if the interleukin 17 is a key, the receptor is basically the lock. So some of the mice got the antibody, which basically jammed up the lock so that the key can't go in. Then they gave both sets of mice, the ones that got the antibody lock jams and the ones that didn't, and the virus produced the ORF8 protein. And both sets of mice had inflammation, but the ones who got the antibodies had lower inflammation. So this is one way. Well, first of all, they confirmed that the ORF8, again, is causing some amount of additional inflammation, and that also the antibody treatment was effective at blocking some of that inflammation caused by the ORF8 protein stimulation of the interleukin 17 receptor. Okay. In a second related story, scientists from the Lerner Research Institute found similar results when analyzing the interactions between ORF8 and interleukin 17 receptors. Wu et al. Found that inflammation was a direct result of these interactions. A puzzling aspect of the ORF8 interleukin 17 receptor interaction, however, is that ORF8 and interleukin 17 are not very structurally similar. So how effective could ORF8 be at actually mimicking the effects of interleukin 17? Wu et al. Isolated blood cells containing interleukin 17 receptors and treated each sample with either ORF8 or interleukin 17 proteins. So we know, in other words, from this research that both ORF8 and interleukin-17 can act as a key. They can fit into the lock of that receptor. The strange thing is that the keys don't really look similar, but they both open the lock, so they're trying to figure out what's going on. After these treatments, researchers analyzed the RNA of each blood cell sample to determine how gene expression differed between the samples. These results would indicate how well ORF8 could mimic the effects of interleukin-17 inside the cell. Because remember, these receptors are basically built, or they evolved to be opened by interleukin-17. They did not evolve to be opened by ORF8, which is a relatively novel chemical, a protein in this case, but a novel protein which is not part of human evolution. It's part of this virus that is trying to hijack the human body. Interestingly, they found that among the upregulated genes, 81.7% of genes were shared between the two sample groups. Among the downregulated genes, 64% of genes were similar between the two groups. These results confirmed that while ORF8 mimics interleukin-17 to a high degree by initiating similar inflammatory pathways, there are still some distinctions between the pathways that they activate through the interleukin-17 receptors. So in other words, they come in through the same door, but what happens from there is somewhat different. In other words, it's about 75% the same overall. To further investigate the relationship between ORF8 and the interleukin-17 receptors, Wu et al. Examined the interactions between the three common ORF8 variants and the interleukin-17 receptors. Through these experiments, researchers found that variants of ORF8 displayed decreased ability to bind to interleukin-17 receptors. Considering that ORF8 is one of the most frequently mutated proteins of SARS-Coronavirus 2, these interactions may provide an explanation for why some variants are more or less likely to cause severe coronavirus symptoms. So basically, you have one kind of ORF8 that is pretty good at binding to this interleukin-17 receptor, and then some variants which still can do it, but not as effectively. And it's those variations, whether the strain of COVID that you catch has one of the mutated forms of ORF8, it may not be as severe because of that, at least in this particular way. Both of these studies represent real progress in understanding the inflammation that occurs in patients with severe SARS-Coronavirus 2 and reveals potential treatments against inflammation that could significantly reduce the danger of COVID infection. It's still a mystery as to why coronaviruses developed a protein that could induce an inflammatory reaction. However, these papers reveal that protein mimics of interleukin-17 and their ability to bind to interleukin-17 receptors may be the key to why some variants of SARS-Coronavirus 2 are more deadly than others. Anyway, that is the introductory article. That's the end of it. Now that we're thinking about COVID causing inflammation, let's look at some of the particular effects, the specific effects on different organ systems. So here's an article from Live Science. The headline is, "We Might Finally Know What Causes COVID Toes." This is by Nicoletta Lanise, published October 7, 2021. A mysterious condition known as COVID toes may finally have an explanation. It turns out that the frostbite-like rashes that appear on a person's toes after they catch COVID-19 may be a sign of a runaway immune response in which the body attacks its own tissues, a new study finds. Cases of COVID toes started cropping up in the early days of the pandemic, and at the time, scientists had a few ideas as to why the condition manifested, Live Science previously reported. For instance, some dermatologists suggested that the telltale skin sores and bumps, known as pernio or chilblains, were caused by inflammation. Others thought that they might result from small blood clots in the toes. Other viral diseases, such as measles, can cause skin rashes, so it wasn't necessarily surprising that COVID-19 could too. But now, the results of a new study published October 5th in the British Journal of Dermatology hint at why the reddish-purple papules pop up on the toes and sometimes the fingers. For the new study, the team recruited 50 patients who were referred to the dermatology department of St. Louis Hospital in Paris after developing chilblain-like lesions for the first time. All of the patients were admitted during April 2020, near the start of the pandemic. The researchers found that most of their study participants carried high levels of autoantibodies, proteins generated by the immune system that inadvertently attack the body's own tissues. They also found evidence that, compared with healthy individuals, the participants showed rampant activity of proteins called type 1 interferons, which switch on pathogen-fighting genes in immune cells. While these interferons help fight off viruses, human cells can end up suffering collateral damage in the process. The study participants also showed signs that the lining of their blood vessels had been damaged, which also may have contributed to the appearance of the purple rashes on their toes, the authors noted. Comment: we can see the toes, we can see some of those capillaries in the toes. Where else might this be happening in the body that we can't see? Immediate question that comes to mind for me. Because where else do you have a lot of small blood vessels? I don't know, your brain? A lot of places. These findings fall in line with those of a very small study published in 2020 in the journal Dermatopathology, the New York Times reported. The study included only 3 patients, but it hinted that the trio developed toe rashes due to a strong interferon-driven immune response. This fiery immune response might help ward off the coronavirus, but it also may have resulted in the lingering rashes, the authors suggested in their report. At the time of the study, nearly 60% of the patients showed symptoms that were consistent with mild COVID-19, such as loss of smell or coughing, but all were negative for the virus on a PCR test. In general, COVID toes usually appear 1 to 4 weeks after a person contracts SARS-Coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and the rashes can sometimes linger for months, The Guardian reported. So it's not surprising that someone would test negative for COVID-19 despite having COVID-related rashes on their feet, considering the rashes might emerge after the virus has been cleared from their system. For context, the 3 participants in the 2020 dermatopathology study also tested negative for COVID-19 at the time of the research. Besides the coronavirus, other triggers of chilblains include diseases like lupus, which none of the study participants had, and exposure to cold, which would be unlikely in springtime, the authors noted in their report. Given that cases of chilblain-like rashes ebbed and flowed with the waves of COVID-19 in 2020, overall, the available clues hint that their patients' rashes were linked to COVID-19 infection, the authors wrote in their report. Comment: because remember, at the time, early 2020, people really did not know what all COVID-19 was going to be doing. The team collected blood samples and skin biopsies from the patients and examined them for various signs of immune system activation. They also compared these samples to samples collected from healthy individuals and people who experienced seasonal chilblains caused by cold weather prior to the pandemic. They found a significant overlap in the results from presumed COVID toe patients and the seasonal chilblain patients, in that both carried autoantibodies and showed signs of heightened type 1 interferon activity. So in the last article, we were talking about COVID protein and its ability to directly trigger inflammation by mimicking some of your immune system's own pro-inflammatory chemicals. So that was one route to inflammation. Here, we have a process where there's evidence of autoantibodies. So we've talked about antibodies before. These are things that your body produces in order to neutralize an antigen, something that is antagonistic to your body. Well, in the case of autoantibodies and autoimmunity generally, this is when you're allergic to yourself. So the antigen that your immune system is targeting is actually something that's part of your body. That's not good because wherever you go, there you are. Can't really get rid of you. So they found that both in the seasonal chilblain patients who didn't have COVID, there was autoimmunity, and in the COVID toe patients who normally did not have seasonal chilblains, but got them basically as a result of COVID, as far as they could tell, the COVID seems to have triggered a similar autoimmune process, and they found the signs of heightened type 1 interferon activity. So anyway, continuing, this finding suggests that the conditions arise from the common mechanism of a runaway immune response, although the immune response itself gets set off by a different trigger in each scenario, the authors wrote. Podiatrist Dr. Ivan Bristow told The Guardian that, for most people, COVID toes eventually clear up on their own without the need for medication. That said, for those whose rashes are slow to heal, the new study could point towards helpful treatments, he said. For example, per the study's results, local or systemic anti-inflammatory agents, such as steroids, may be effective in treating COVID toes, the New York Times reported. So that's the end of that article. Just getting warmed up. So far we've got 2 disease processes triggered by COVID, and this whole inflammation topic, this is one of the things that seems to be a major problem with COVID. Now, as a side note, before we get into the next article, I was looking at some material about ivermectin. Yes, that ivermectin. No, don't take it. However, I did see some fairly measured, for once, anecdotal reporting of somebody who had long COVID, which was pretty significantly impairing. They really noticed it from day to day. And they tried some ivermectin that they got, from India or something like that, had to pay in crypto, etc. And they did find temporary relief while taking the ivermectin. Then, pretty much as soon as they went off of it, it came back, all the symptoms that they were experiencing. So one of the things that ivermectin does do is it has some anti-inflammatory properties. It's possible that its ability to act as an anti-inflammatory agent may have contributed to some of that temporary relief, if indeed it wasn't just a fluke. However, I should note, there's an article that came out recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. The title is Effective Early Treatment with Ivermectin Among Patients with COVID-19. This was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled adaptive platform trial involving SARS-Coronavirus 2 positive adults recruited from 12 public health clinics in Brazil. And basically the conclusions were treatment with ivermectin did not result in a lower incidence of medical admission to a hospital due to progression of COVID-19 or of prolonged emergency department observation among outpatients with an early diagnosis of COVID-19. So basically, the people who took ivermectin, basically some got ivermectin, some got a placebo, and some got something else. The ivermectin group did not have a lower incidence of hospital admission. So basically, people have talked about possibly that drug has antiviral effects. It is mainly used as an antiparasitic. That said, sometimes things do more than one thing. People were talking about, does it have antiviral activity, as it is sometimes also used in that capacity. But what we're talking about here is its use as an anti-inflammatory, in which case, if we're looking for an anti-inflammatory substance, there are other options available. Just wanted to throw that in while we're kind of cleaning house here. Anyway, on to the next article. This is from The Guardian by Linda Geddes, dated April 6, 2022. Title is COVID linked to 33-fold increase in risk of potentially fatal blood clot. Infection with virus also associated with 5-fold increase in risk of deep vein thrombosis, data suggest. So, first of all, what is deep vein thrombosis, or DVT? Well, thrombosis describes clotting. A thrombus is a clot. What's a deep vein? This is a vein deep in your system. It's not superficial. Usually, it's in the lower half of the body, so the pelvis or legs. What basically happens is you get a clot forming in one of the deep veins. You can get swelling, inflammation, and there's a real danger if the thrombus or the clot detaches or embolizes and starts traveling through your veins back up to the heart, because it can block basically the blood supply to your lungs, and then you don't get any oxygen, etc., etc. So, starting the article, catching COVID is associated with a 5-fold increase in the risk of deep vein thrombosis and a 33-fold increase in the risk of a potentially fatal blood clot on the lung in the 30 days after becoming infected, data suggest. The findings, published in the British Medical Journal on Thursday, could help explain a doubling in the incidence of, and deaths from, blood clots in England since the start of the pandemic compared with the same periods in 2018 and 2019. They also help to put the very small increased risk of blood clots associated with COVID-19 vaccination into context. Quote, the degree of complications associated with COVID-19 is much stronger and lasts for much longer than what we might be getting after vaccination, said Dr. Frederick Ho, a lecturer in public health at the University of Glasgow, who was not involved in the research. Quote, even those people with mild symptoms who do not need to be hospitalized might have a small increase in the risk of blood clots, unquote. So that is, even if your COVID is not severe enough that you are hospitalized, you may have an increase in the risk of blood clots. But if you are hospitalized, like your acute early phase of COVID is severe enough that you need to be hospitalized, remember what I said before, when you read COVID hospitalization, read severe organ damage. That's what's going on there. People do not walk out of the hospital with COVID feeling like $1,000,000. They sort of just barely survive. Continuing. Although previous research had suggested that catching COVID was associated with an increased risk of blood clots, it was unclear for how long this risk remained and whether mild infections also increased people's risk. To address these uncertainties, Anne-Marie Forss-Colony at Umeå University in Sweden and her colleagues measured the risk of DVT, pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot on the lung, and various types of bleeding, such as gastrointestinal bleeding, or a burst blood vessel in the brain, in more than 1 million people with confirmed COVID infections and more than 4 million uninfected individuals. Overall, they identified a 33-fold increase in the risk of pulmonary embolism, a 5-fold increase in the risk of DVT, and an almost 2-fold increase in the risk of bleeding in the 30 days after infection. People remained at increased risk of pulmonary embolism for 6 months after becoming infected, and for 2 and 3 months for bleeding and DVT. Although the risks were highest in patients with more severe illness, I would add during the acute phase, even those with mild COVID had a 3-fold increased risk of DVT and a 7-fold increased risk of pulmonary embolism. No increased risk of bleeding was found in those who experienced mild infections. Quote, "Pulmonary embolism can be fatal, so it is important to be aware of this risk," said Connolly. "If you suddenly find yourself short of breath and it doesn't pass, and you've been infected with the coronavirus, then it might be an idea to seek help, because we find this increased risk for up to 6 months. Ho said the results remained relevant even in the Omicron era, since current vaccines were highly effective against severe COVID, but breakthrough infections were common, even after a third booster dose of a vaccine. Quote, "Despite the potential for new variants of concern, most governments are removing restrictions and shifting their focus to determining how best to live with COVID." Comment, we've already discussed numerous times how terrible an idea that is. Continuing, "This study reminds us of the need to remain vigilant to the complications associated with even mild SARS-Coronavirus 2 infection, including blood clots." So there you go, end of article, add it to the grab bag. Now let's turn to the heart. COVID and the heart, it spares no one. Research now tells us that COVID doesn't discriminate when it comes to heart problems. This is from March 14 at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Interview by Stephanie Desmond. Until now, people who suffered mild or asymptomatic COVID-19 were thought to have dodged the brunt of the virus's brutal side effects. But new evidence has revealed that anyone infected with COVID is at higher risk for heart issues, including clots, inflammation, and arrhythmias, that's irregular heartbeat, a risk that persists even in relatively healthy people long after the illness has passed. In this Q&A, adapted from the March 9 episode of Public Health on Call, Ziad Al-Ali, Director of the Clinical Epidemiology Center and Chief of Research and Education Service at Veterans Affairs, St. Louis Healthcare System, talks with Stephanie Desmond about COVID-19 and the heart, including his recent study, which found a significant risk of heart problems in people a year after being diagnosed with COVID. You just published a study that says that in some people who've had COVID, heart issues can persist for a year or more. What does this mean, and what did you study? We've known for a while that during the acute phase, the first 30 days of COVID-19, people who have severe disease and need to be admitted to the hospital or ICU may develop heart complications. We didn't know what happened to people's hearts in the long term, 6 months to a year out, or what happened to people who had mild disease and did not need hospitalization or ICU care. We did this study to evaluate the 1-year risk of heart problems in people who got COVID-19, compared to nearly 11 million controls of people who did not. What did you find? The major finding was that people with COVID-19 have a higher risk of all sorts of heart problems at 1 year. That included arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats or the heart beating too fast or too slow, and atrial fibrillation, a fast heart rhythm in a particular pattern. We found evidence of an increased risk of stroke, of blood clots in the legs and the lungs, and of heart failure and heart attacks. The increased risk of a broad spectrum of heart problems was evident. I went into it thinking that the risk was going to be the most pronounced and evident in people who smoked a lot or had diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, or some other risk factors. What we found is that even in people who did not have any heart problems to start with, were athletic, did not have a high body mass index, were not obese, did not smoke, did not have kidney disease or diabetes, even in people who were previously healthy and had no risk factors or problems with the heart, COVID-19 affected them in such a way that manifested a higher risk of heart problems than people who did not get COVID-19. So, timeout, comment. Basically, all these tens of millions of cases that are racking up, these are weakened hearts, okay? That's what it is. People who get COVID likely to have heart weakness that can manifest as various kinds of heart problems. The next article we're going to read is basically a case study in that. It was really eye-opening that the risk was also evident in people who did not have severe COVID-19 that necessitated hospitalization or ICU care. People who got COVID-19 and were asymptomatic, or got COVID-19 that was so mild that they were able to nurse it at home without going to the doctor, still developed an increased risk of heart problems a year out from getting infected. What's going on in the body? A lot of different things could be happening. It's possible that the virus itself and the immune response to it cause an intense inflammation that subsequently hits the heart and results in some of the manifestations we've seen here. It's possible that COVID-19 may attack the endothelial cells that line the vessels of the heart. Some of these cells might die and eventually facilitate the formation of blood clots and blockages of the arteries or vessels of the heart. There are several other mechanisms that revolve around something called the ACE receptor. The virus has something called a spike protein, which is like a key that engages a lock, the ACE receptor. That allows the virus into cells, including heart cells. Why would SARS-Coronavirus 2, the virus that causes COVID-19, which we all thought about as a respiratory virus, attack the heart up to a year down the road? That's likely one of the explanations. So that's the end of that. Moving on to the next article, which, as I said, is a case study in somebody having heart damage from COVID. This is an article from the Washington Post. Title is "A 45-year-old Kansas mayor needs a pacemaker after a long-haul COVID fight." Quote, "I thought I was going to beat it." This is by Gina Harkins from August 12, 2021. Michelle de la Isla describes herself as one of the healthiest people she knows. She's a biker and runner, so when she caught the coronavirus in January, the Topeka, Kansas mayor said that she expected a speedy recovery. 8 months and 3 hospitalizations later, the 45-year-old mom of 3, who ran for Congress in 2020, says she will have a pacemaker implanted next week to fix heart damage inflicted by the virus. De la Isla is one of millions thought to be suffering from long-haul COVID, a lingering condition that leaves some facing heart palpitations, shortness of breath, fatigue, joint pain, and other health problems months after their initial illness. Comment, of course, we also know this as long COVID. Quote, "COVID is no joke," De La Isla, a Democrat who has served as mayor since 2018, said during a Topeka City Council meeting on Tuesday. "On Monday, I'm going to have a pretty big procedure. This post-COVID has been extremely difficult, and it has impacted my heart, so I'm going to have a bionic heart starting on Monday with a new pacemaker," unquote. 4 studies published this year show as many as a third of coronavirus cases resulting in long-haul COVID. Some of those cases followed mild infections, according to the University of California at Davis. Research in England released in June found as many as 2 million people living there were experiencing long-haul symptoms, the Washington Post reported. De La Isla, who lost the race to represent her state's 2nd congressional district to Republican Jake LaTurner, maybe extraneous information, told KWCH that she did not expect to be experiencing serious health problems months after getting the virus. Quote, "With all the work that I've done to remain healthy, I thought I was going to beat it," she told the station. The mayor could not immediately be reached for comment Wednesday night. During Tuesday's meeting, De La Isla encouraged members of her community to get vaccinated against the coronavirus. As with much of the country, Kansas has seen daily coronavirus case counts and deaths spike as the highly contagious Delta variant spreads rapidly. Remember, this is from last year, 2021. Hospitalizations in Kansas rose nearly 25% over the past week, according to the Post's coronavirus tracker. Deaths are up more than 66% in that time. According to the Post's tracker, 46% of Kansans have been fully vaccinated, which is slightly lower than the national average of 50%, Quote, "I'm a huge advocate for those who choose to get the vaccine," De La Isla said Tuesday. De La Isla tested positive for the virus in January after receiving her first dose of a coronavirus vaccine, KWCH reported. She was eligible to get the shot at the beginning of the year because of her position in government. The mayor has since spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital during 3 stays. Getting the pacemaker will be her second surgery tied to the coronavirus, she told KWCH after having her gallbladder removed when the illness attacked her digestive system. So comment, I haven't been mentioning that in the list of like lungs, heart, liver, kidneys, etc. But your gut, I mean, we've covered this in the past, your gut is probably one of the biggest reservoirs of COVID where it sort of lives in your body after you get the infection. The virus basically affects the lungs and respiratory system of pretty much everybody who gets it, but it also affects the digestive system of about 75-80% of people who get it, so that's really common as well. De La Isla told the station she has tried to get back to her exercise routine, but, quote, "in the last month or two, things have gotten more complicated." That led to discussions with her doctor about implanting a pacemaker, which can sense an irregular heartbeat. A small device can restore a patient's heart rate to the regular pace. Viruses can trigger inflammation of the heart, and according to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the organ is a target in COVID-19 infections. De La Isla, who is not running for another term in the November election, said that she shared the news of her pacemaker to be transparent with community members. Quote, "On Monday, this is going to be fixed, and then you're going to have to put up with me," she told Topeka's city council members. So that's the end of the article, and there you go. Somebody is fit, healthy, biker, runner, and the virus just attacks the heart. It doesn't really matter if you've been a good little boy, girl, or other. It's just attacking the heart and other major organs. It's true that there are some standing risk factors, yes, but even if you don't have most of the risk factors, you can still get this damage. It's just the way that it works. So on to the next article, starting to make a pivot to the brain and nervous system. Here's an article from the Mirror by Miriam Stoppard, April 10. COVID affects major organs in the body in ways we never dreamed of. The latest research from Oxford University shows the areas in the brain worst hit by shrinkage, yes, shrinkage in the brain, as a result of COVID, but the virus can impact the nervous system, says Dr. Miriam Stoppard. I saw a summary of this research a couple of weeks ago, this is the article now, and felt it was so important I put it on my page in an abbreviated form. Now that I have the full report from Oxford University, I can write about it in more detail. COVID affects major organs in the body in ways we never even dreamed of. One of them turns out to be the brain, and this latest research finds it doesn't even have to be a serious infection to inflict damage. It looks as if the areas of the brain to do with smell are worst hit by shrinkage, but the virus can spread throughout the nervous system. We don't know as yet if these effects persist or are reversible. Most of the past studies showing COVID-19 may cause brain-related abnormalities are in hospital patients with severe disease. The effects of milder COVID were unknown until now. Professor Gwenaël Duaud and colleagues from Oxford University investigated changes in the brains of 785 participants from UK Biobank, a large-scale biomedical database and research resource. Participants aged 51 to 81 underwent 2 brain scans, on average 38 months apart, as well as cognitive tests. A total of 401 participants tested positive for COVID between their 2 scans, of whom 15 were hospitalized. The remaining 384 individuals who didn't get infected acted as controls. About 4.5 months following infection, the researchers noted a greater reduction in gray matter thickness in the regions of the brain associated with smell, the orbitofrontal cortex and parahippocampal gyrus, and a reduction in the size of the whole brain. On average, the participants who were affected with COVID also showed greater cognitive decline between their 2 scans, associated with the shrinkage of a specific part of the cerebellum or hindbrain, which is linked to cognition. Professor Stephen Smith, senior author on the study, commented, quote, "Another strength of this study is that it investigated the same people at 2 different times." It's called longitudinal. Importantly here, the first scan of UK Biobank participants was obtained before they became infected with SARS-Coronavirus 2, with the second scan after infection. The fact that we have the pre-infection scan helps us to distinguish brain changes related to the infection from differences that may have pre-existed in their brains. This before and after tracking makes this study unique. We therefore may have found the blueprint for the degenerative spread of COVID-19 related to the sense of smell, inflammation, or immune response of the nervous system. That's incredible news. So, end of article. I hope you're holding on because we're just beginning the discussion of COVID brain injuries. Here's a study. This is from December 2021 by Xin-Jie Yang in ACS Chemical Neuroscience. The title is Persistent Brainstem Dysfunction in Long COVID, a Hypothesis. So I'm just going to read the abstract on this one. Long COVID is a post-viral illness that can affect survivors of COVID-19 regardless of initial disease severity or age. Let me just read that again. It can affect survivors of COVID-19 regardless of initial disease severity or age. There are risk factors that will increase your chances, but it can affect anyone, including younger people with asymptomatic acute stage cases. So when I said, how mad this makes me before, it's because all of this talk about, oh, it's just a cold, get back to work, blah, blah, blah. They've been giving people heart damage and brain damage and all this stuff. Anyway, continuing. Symptoms of long COVID include fatigue, dyspnea, that's difficulty breathing, gastrointestinal and cardiac problems, cognitive impairments, myalgia, and others. While the possible causes of long COVID include long-term tissue damage, viral persistence, and chronic inflammation, the review proposes, perhaps for the first time, that persistent brainstem dysfunction may also be involved. This hypothesis can be split into two parts. The first is the brainstem tropism and damage in COVID-19. Tropism is that it moves towards it. So brainstem tropism is it moves towards the brainstem and targets it. As the brainstem has a relatively high expression of ACE2 receptors compared with other brain regions, SARS-Coronavirus 2 may exhibit tropism therein. So that's, again, the ACE2 receptors. That's how COVID gets into your cells. The brainstem has a lot of those receptors, so it tends to get hit with a lot of the virus. A lot of the brainstem cells get infected. Evidence also suggests that neuropilin-1, a co-receptor of SARS-Coronavirus 2, may be expressed in the brainstem. So just to explain those terms, neuropilin there's a couple of different neuropilins. They're found in the brain. They're involved in a number of different processes. As far as it being a co-receptor, we talked before about how the receptor is like the lock and the ligand is like the key. To use a somewhat crude metaphor, a co-receptor is kind of like an usher standing at the entrance of a theater who looks at your ticket and then sort of points you to your seat. Again, crude metaphor, but that's a co-receptor. It kind of helps to facilitate the ligand binding with the receptor process. Continuing. Indeed, autopsy studies have found SARS-Coronavirus 2 RNA and proteins in the brainstem. The brainstem is also highly prone to damage from pathological immune or vascular, that's your blood flow activation, which has also been observed in autopsy of COVID-19 cases. The second part concerns functions of the brainstem that overlap with symptoms of long COVID. The brainstem contains numerous distinct nuclei and subparts that regulate the respiratory, breathing, cardiovascular, heart beating and maybe blood pressure, gastrointestinal, that's your digestion, and neurological processes, which can be linked to long COVID. As neurons do not readily regenerate, brainstem dysfunction may be long-lasting. So, nerve cells do not readily regenerate. So once you have damage, it's not necessarily going to heal, and thus is long COVID. Indeed, brainstem dysfunction has been implicated in other similar disorders, such as chronic pain and migraine, and myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. So that's that abstract. So basically, they're saying that there may be two things at work here. The brainstem is a target for COVID in a couple of ways. One, directly, because it has a lot of ACE2 receptors, which COVID likes to try to get into. And number two, it also can be affected secondarily if the immune system is off or if there is some kind of cardiovascular blood flow problem. It can be damaged. So you can get damage both directly from the virus or from pathological immune or vascular activation, as they say. And then once it's damaged, that can be long lasting. So That can, because of the functions of the brainstem, what it actually does. It's you can see in the graphic in the upper right-hand corner, you see that it plays a part in regulating all kinds of systems in your body. So you get damage to that, you may get dysregulated organ function because it's not getting the proper signals because the control box, the brainstem, is damaged. So continuing with the brain, we've got two more articles. This one's from Forbes. Again, William A. Hazeltine writes a lot of these articles. The title is COVID-19, Long-Term Brain Injury. This is from March 14, 2022. And all this stuff is in the wake of Omicron. We had basically as many infections during Omicron as we had during the entire pandemic up to that point. And now a lot of people are like, what just happened? Like, what kind of damage was actually sustained during that November to January, February period? SARS-Coronavirus 2 infection can damage many organs other than the lungs. The most troubling is damage to the brain. You've only got one, and it doesn't really grow back. A series of recent studies document long-term brain damage in as many as 1/4 of all those infected, regardless of the severity of the initial disease. Let me read that again. A series of recent studies document long-term brain damage in as many as 1/4 of all those infected with SARS-Coronavirus 2, regardless of the severity of the initial disease. Those numbers are daunting, considering that an estimated 140 million U.S. Americans have been infected by SARS-Coronavirus 2. Symptoms such as brain fog, fatigue, depression, and a host of other maladies may be mild or incapacitating. Several studies warn that the treatment of those with long-term brain injury will strain the healthcare system for years to come. Understanding the origin and treatment of COVID-19 related brain injury is a high priority for medical science. A recent study by Frontera et al. Of the NYU Grossman School of Medicine evaluated the cognitive function of COVID-19 patients 6 months after they were hospitalized for COVID-19. To their surprise, over 90% of their total cohort reported at least one neurological symptom. Among those that had not experienced neurological complications while hospitalized, 88% reported new cognitive symptoms. So basically, during the hospitalization, they didn't notice any neurological, nothing was off. But then almost 9 out of 10 of them afterwards did report new cognitive symptoms. These cognitive impairments seem to be separate and apart from damage due to hypoxia or lack of oxygen to the brain, often experienced by those hospitalized for severe COVID-19. So comment, like I said, you get hospitalized for COVID, all kinds of things are happening. First of all, you have massive viral load in your body doing all kinds of damage usually, but also if it's affecting your lungs, as we were talking about before, the little gas exchange centers in your lungs can fill up with fluid, impairing the gas exchange, and you can suffer from hypoxia. Your system doesn't have enough oxygen, and your brain not having enough oxygen is not a good thing. Cells need oxygen on pretty much a constant basis, and they die without it. And as we said, brain cells do not easily regenerate. Continuing, reportedly, some individuals that recover from mild or asymptomatic infection may later develop complications that are not immediately apparent. The table below lists commonly reported neurological symptoms by previously hospitalized COVID-19 patients. So we have a chart here. There's a couple of different studies. The first study is Frontera et al. 2021, and they found a 91% incidence of new neurological complications, 346 people out of 382 people. Yeah. So what was commonly reported? 56% reported limited daily activities. 50% reported abnormal cognition. 46% reported worse anxiety. 36% reported worse sleep. 36% also reported fatigue. 25% reported depression. Another study, Rass et al. 2022, out of 81 people, 48 or 59% reported new neurological complications. What did they report? 38% reported fatigue. 25% reported concentration difficulties. So comment above where it says abnormal cognition, I would definitely put things like concentration difficulties in that category. Also, the next one is 25% reported forgetfulness. So actually, if we add 25 and 25 together, there may have been some overlap, but that does total up to 50 if we assume that those were all separate individuals. 22% reported sleep disturbances, 17% reported myalgia, which is muscle pain, 17% reported limb weakness, 16% reported headache, 16% reported impaired sensation, and 15% hyposmia, that is lack of smell. Specifically, hyposmia is reduced or low sense of smell. If it's complete, you can't smell at all, that is anosmia. Then in the third study, Valdez et al., 2021, this was out of 215 participants, 106 reported these symptoms, 49%. Orientation difficulties, 86% reporting that. Impaired language skills, kind of important, 60%. Attention impairments, 39%. Executive function deficits, 39%. Executive functioning is kind of like planning your life. So think of all of the cognitive skills that go into setting and achieving goals. It's things like making priorities, reasoning, attentional awareness and control, general self-control, delay of gratification, all of the kind of self-conscious reasoning tasks that go into planning and executing particular tasks. So 39% reported deficits in that general area, and then 14% reported memory problems. So resuming the article, through in-person screenings, a team of neurologists diagnosed more than half of those who participated in the NYU study with encephalopathy. Encephalopathy broadly refers to damage or disease that alters the brain's structure or function. Let's read that again. More than half of those who participated in the NYU study were diagnosed with encephalopathy, damage or disease that alters the brain's structure or function. This is not the flu. Those diagnosed with encephalopathy had a higher than expected incidence of strokes and seizures. Another 21% had symptoms related to oxygen starvation, related to COVID-19 damage to the lung, and in some cases to the heart. Frontera et al. Found significant correlations between the prevalence of neurological complications and an inability to return to daily activity, even 6 months after the initial infection. Those that developed neurological complications while hospitalized for COVID-19 in particular were twice as likely to perform worse on cognitive assessments compared to individuals not diagnosed during hospitalization. For instance, over 50% reported being unable to return to daily activities, and 59% of those that were previously employed are now not able to return to work. Let's read that again. Over 50% reported being unable to return to daily activities, and 59% of those that were previously employed, that's the majority, are now not able to return to work. Frontera et al. Observed that among those that completed their mental health outcome tests, 62% of individuals previously hospitalized for COVID-19 scored worse for anxiety, sleep, fatigue, and depression, in contrast to population averages. When they compared their COVID-19 groups with and without neurological diagnosis, no significant differences were found. This suggests that poor mental health outcomes may be linked to the experience of being severely sick with the virus, but mental health issues alone does not explain why some are unable to return to their daily activities. So comment, in other words, this isn't just people are emotionally messed up, they're sad, isolated, whatever, and that's why they can't go back. Now, profound mental emotional disturbance can cause impaired functioning, but this is saying that it does not account for that. There is something else functionally going on in the brain. How long do COVID-19 related neurological complications last? A new study by Ross et al. From Austria attempted to answer this question by interviewing previously hospitalized COVID-19 patients 3 months after infection, and then again 1 year later. While a few participants experienced some cognitive improvement, 73% showed no difference between 3 months and a year. That's a lot. In fact, at 1 year, almost 60% of respondents continued to report neurological symptoms, including fatigue, concentration difficulties, sleep disturbances, headaches, impaired sensation, and loss of smell. To their surprise, the prevalence of these symptoms did not correlate with disease severity. So, comment. Let's just break that sentence down because I think that this should be reworded, and this is kind of the point I'm trying to make here. To their surprise, the prevalence of these symptoms, the neurological symptoms, fatigue, concentration difficulties, sleep disturbances, headaches, impaired sensation, and loss of smell, did not correlate with disease severity. I would call those disease severity, just not during the acute phase. So that's the point I'm trying to make. What we're trying to do is separate out the initial 3 weeks from what COVID-19 actually is, which is something that can cause neurological symptoms in a majority of people that get the neurological symptoms. These are long lasting. They're at a year still experiencing them. So that's what COVID-19 is. In people who get the neurological symptoms, a majority still have them a year after infection. This is not the flu. So when we think about COVID-19 disease severity, you've got to stop thinking about those first 3 weeks, because that is just one phase of a much longer illness. And just to clarify one thing, I think there's a slight error in the text. It says a new study by Ross et al. From Austria attempted to answer this question by interviewing previously hospitalized COVID-19 patients. So I thought, if they're all previously hospitalized, that's kind of the same level of acute disease severity. However, I actually did look at that study. It's linked, and that was not the case. So that is an error in the write-up. Continuing, another NYU Langone study, Valdez et al., found the patients who were Black, unemployed, and/or had fewer years of education were more likely to perform worse on cognitive assessments 6 months after being hospitalized for COVID-19 compared to other demographic groups. The authors speculate that the observed differences are a consequence of social and economic disparities. These observations raise troubling long-term issues for the medical system and for society. Must we now add the millions of people disabled by COVID-19 and in need of chronic care, many of whom are young and in the prime of life, to the rapidly growing ranks of the elderly, in need of similar social and medical services? How do we account for the loss of revenue from both the employers' and employees' perspective? The time is now to begin to understand and plan for this new potential social and medical crisis. 1, we need to understand how SARS-Coronavirus 2 damages the brain and how such damage may be avoided. 2, we need to know how many people suffer from COVID-19 related brain damage and how long such symptoms last. 3, we need to plan for the social and medical care of those most seriously affected, those who cannot care for themselves, as well as those who cannot return to work. Our social support systems must recognize COVID-19 related long-term disability as a reality and assure those who suffer are protected. It is now clear that our encounter with COVID-19 will not fade with the pandemic, but will endure for decades. And that's the end of the article. Let me just add, at this rate, the pandemic may endure for decades. At this point, we really just don't know. Here's our next article. This is the last one on the brain. This is from National Geographic. Headline: Even mild COVID-19 can cause your brain to shrink. Yes, even mild COVID-19 can cause your brain to shrink. So again, same with the last article, we need to change our thinking about disease severity to not just thinking about that first month or first 3 weeks. Stop thinking about the acute phase, because that is just a small part of a much longer disease experience. So, even mild COVID-19 in the acute phase, should be in parentheses there, can cause your brain to shrink. Recent brain imaging shows the disease can cause physical changes equivalent to a decade of aging and can trigger problems with attention and memory. Exactly why is still a mystery. By Sanjay Mishra. This is from 19 April 2022. After being bedridden with fever and coughing for 3.5 days, Elena Katzap thought COVID-19 was behind her. The writer and teacher in Los Angeles had contracted the virus at the end of January 2022, and she felt grateful that she only got a mild case. She didn't have breathing difficulties and didn't need to be hospitalized, and she recovered from that within days. Quote, I very specifically remember saying, God, it feels so good to be healthy again, says Katzap. Then all of a sudden, the very next day, it smacked me, and I didn't know what it was because it started off with nausea and some stomach issues and some weird forgetfulness. So comment, I have said this in other videos during the COVID videos. I believe that I had long COVID for about a year. I had fairly pronounced fatigue at first that lasted for several months. I had ongoing shortness of breath and also the attention problems. Basically, the way I would describe it is I would get a thought in my head, I'd start thinking about something, and it was like an invisible hand just appeared and just snatched the thought out of my mind, and suddenly it was gone. So whatever I was thinking about, I was just like, what was I thinking about? It's just gone. So imagine anything, right? Think about a red cat, like a primary red cartoon cat. You're thinking about it. You're thinking about the key, holding it in your mind's eye, and you're going, okay, that's a cat. Maybe it has a little story, but suddenly something just pulls it out of your mind, and you suddenly have no idea what you were just thinking about. That's what it was like. Just the inability to hold a thought in your mind for more than about 7 or 8 seconds. It wasn't entirely constant, but it was much more frequent than I have ever experienced. I don't have running attention, concentration, or memory issues. So it was, definitely novel. This was not something I had really experienced on a running basis before. I mean, everybody has brain farts, but like this was multiple times a day, really like once or twice an hour. I would just suddenly be really struggling to think clearly. And, I learned to sort of work around it. And I felt like after 1 year, it got significantly better. But kind of all at once, and it was like 12 months later, I just suddenly was like, oh, I can kind of think again. And, apparently a lot of people aren't so lucky. But yeah, I felt like in my case it cleared up, but I had significant problems for like an entire year. And I still have some other, I think, issues that I've never had before health-wise. But anyway, continuing. Katzap has since experienced an acute loss of memory with poor concentration. She draws blanks in the middle of conversations and words fail her mid-sentence. Quote, "It isn't physically painful, but it's so frustrating," she laments. Comment, I will back that up. It's incredibly frustrating, especially if you never had to cope with this before in your life. It's like suddenly you just can't think. And it's really irritating. It really is. The United States remains the world's worst affected country by cases and numbers of deaths. Let's read that again. The United States remains the world's worst affected country by cases and numbers of deaths. Of the roughly 80 million Americans who've gotten COVID-19 so far, about 1 of every 4 survivors suffers from impaired cognition, commonly described as brain fog, a symptom mirrored in other parts of the world. While this isn't a formal medical term, says Edward Shorter, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, it has become an umbrella term for describing an array of symptoms such as confusion, word-finding difficulties, short-term memory loss, dizziness, or inability to concentrate. Patients hospitalized with COVID-19 are almost 3 times more likely than those not hospitalized to have impaired cognition. But brain scans now show that even a mild case of COVID-19 can shrink part of the brain, causing physical changes equivalent to a decade of aging. Quote, "There is evidence of neurologic injury after COVID-19 that is persistent," says Ayush Batra, a neurologist at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Quote, "We are seeing biological and biochemical evidence of it. We are seeing radiographic evidence of it," that's x-rays, "and most importantly, the patients are complaining of their symptoms. It is affecting their quality of life and day-to-day functioning." Batra, together with his colleagues, has shown chemical indicators of injured brain neurons among long COVID patients with neurologic symptoms. The drastic impact of COVID-19 on the brain. Some of the most compelling evidence of neurological damage after mild COVID-19, in the acute phase, comes from UK researchers who investigated brain changes in people before and after they got the disease. The 785 participants between 51 and 81 years old who had already been scanned before the start of the pandemic were scanned on average 3 years apart as part of the UK Biobank project. Tests or medical records showed that 401 of these volunteers had become infected with SARS-Coronavirus 2. Most had mild infections, only 15 of the 401 were hospitalized. The results showed that 4.5 months after a mild COVID infection, patients had lost, on average, between 0.2 and 2% of brain volume and had thinner gray matter than healthy people. By comparison, older adults lose between 0.2 and 0.3% of their gray matter each year in the hippocampus, a region linked to memory. So the max in the COVID patients was 2%. The average non-COVID max is 0.3%. So that is up to nearly 7 times more gray matter loss in the COVID-19 patients. That's not good. Okay. In the region of the brain linked to smell, the COVID-19 patients had 0.7% more tissue damage compared to healthy people. So again, if we're talking about less than 0.5% normally, this is a large percentage increase. In other words, 0.7% is several times more than 0.2 or 0.3%. Okay. The infected participants' performance on cognitive tests also declined more rapidly than before illness. They took 8 and 12% longer on the 2 tests that measured attention, visual screening ability, and processing speed. The patients were not significantly slower on memory recall, reaction time, or reasoning tests. So that's kind of specific damage. So you've got about 10% longer for attention, visual screening, and processing speed, but not memory recall, reaction time, or reasoning. Interesting. Quote, we could in turn relate this greater mental ability decline to their greater loss of gray matter in a specific part of the brain, says Gwenaël Douaud, a neuroscientist at the University of Oxford who led the UK study. Overall, studies consistently show that COVID-19 patients score significantly lower in tests of attention, memory, and executive function compared to healthy people. Jacques Hugon, a neurologist at University of Paris Lariboisière Hospital, says it isn't clear if the brain will mend itself or whether patients will ever recover, even with cognitive rehabilitation. Quote, we don't know exactly what's going on in the brain, says Hugon. Perhaps the damage COVID-19 causes in the brain will evolve into various neurodegenerative disorders. Quote, we don't know that for sure at the moment, but it is a risk, and we need to follow the patients very carefully for the years to come, unquote. So comment, this is, a little scary to think about, but we're trained to think about COVID as something that everyone just recovers from if you don't die. But that's not necessarily the case. It's possible that people have an impairment, you suffer damage and then you're impaired, and that never gets better. Or even worse than that, you could suffer the impairment and then 20 years down the line, it could predispose you to a neurodegenerative disorder. Or maybe not even 20 years down the line, maybe 5 or 10. We don't know. What causes brain fog and cognitive decline? Even before COVID-19, viral infections were known to cause long-lasting cognitive impairments. It is well established that viral infections significantly increase the world's burden of neurological diseases. While there's no consensus yet on the exact cause of COVID-19's cognitive impacts, its effect on various organs can be catastrophic, which means that there are many ways the disease could be affecting the brain. Because COVID-19 affects respiration, it can starve the brain of oxygen, as seen in autopsy data from Finland. In rare cases, COVID-19 can also damage the brain by causing encephalitis, a form of brain inflammation. More broadly, COVID-19 can elicit a severe immune response that triggers a storm of proteins called cytokines, which amplify inflammation throughout the body. Long-term inflammation has been shown to promote cognitive decline and neurodegenerative disease, and so could be causing neurodegeneration among COVID-19 survivors. COVID-19 also increases the risk for blood clots for up to 6 months, which can cause strokes that deprive the brain tissue of oxygen. One study found large stray bone marrow cells, responsible for the production of blood clotting platelets, lodged in the brain capillaries of individuals who died from COVID-19 infection. Wow. These cells could cause strokes in COVID-19 patients and trigger some neurologic impairments. Yeah, definitely. Some scientists even fear that COVID-19 survivors could be at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease, based on evidence for a protein called beta amyloid in the brains of younger patients who died of COVID-19. Studies are also accumulating that show direct evidence of the SARS-Coronavirus 2 virus invading the brain. A study by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, currently under review, illustrates how SARS-Coronavirus 2 can spread well beyond the lungs and the respiratory tract. This study suggests that the inability of the immune system to clear the virus from the body could be a potential contributor to long COVID symptoms, including brain fog. Counting mild COVID-19 cases. Beyond pinpointing the causes, one major concern is that it's difficult to get an accurate count of how many COVID-19 patients have developed cognitive issues, in part because these symptoms don't always manifest immediately after infection. This was the case for Richard Newman, a U.S. Army veteran who is now an IT manager in Houston, Texas. He suffered a severe COVID-19 infection in June 2021 and spent 2 weeks in the ICU. But he didn't experience cognitive problems, including trouble recognizing people, until a month after he was discharged from the hospital. Quote, "I knew the face. I knew I was supposed to know them, but I couldn't remember their name," says Newman. His symptoms have not improved much 8 months after he was first diagnosed with COVID-19. Quote, "It is very horrible, it is very debilitating, and it really affects your quality of life," he says. At least one study shows that 2/3 of COVID-19 survivors, seen at 59 hospitals in the U.S., were diagnosed with cognitive issues during the 6-month follow-up. However, as the recent UK-based study shows, even mild cases can put people at risk, and tracking those patients will be a challenge if they don't make the connection between mild COVID-19 and any neurologic symptoms that pop up later. Other survivors may be reluctant to mention their experience with COVID-19 and subsequent neurological problems for fear of stigma and discrimination. Comment, I don't have a screenshot here, but Feigl Ding was just tweeting about an insurance company, I don't remember the name, denying coverage because of long COVID. So that's, a start right there. Experts also worry that between the wide availability of vaccines and the rise of the relatively milder, not really, Omicron variants, I don't know why they keep publishing this shit. It's not milder, maybe slightly less than Delta, but that could easily change with one of the new spin-offs. And Delta is way more severe than original COVID. So, if you're 300% as severe as the original, and then something is, slightly less, okay, well, it's still 290% more severe than the original. That's not really milder. Please stop fucking writing that. Anyway, people are letting their guard down too soon because they're not concerned about the possible cognitive damage from getting sick. Although COVID-19 vaccines are highly effective in protecting against serious illness during the acute phase, again, we got to add this in, during the acute phase, they do not protect against long COVID in people who become infected despite vaccination. Quote, "We need to move away from quantifying the impact of the disease only in terms of deaths and severe cases," says the University of Oxford's Dowd, as evidence from studies on long COVID and our study show that even mild infection during the acute phase can be damaging. So that's the end of the article. And again, during the acute phase needs to become a phrase everybody starts using. We need to differentiate between COVID in the first month and then all of the other effects of COVID, which are regular and normal. Long COVID, that happens to a lot of people, like 30%, that's a lot. So you need to distinguish between COVID up front, COVID in the acute phase, COVID in the first month, and the entire rest of COVID, which is significant. In fact, let's do a thought experiment. Let's play a game. Let's imagine that COVID killed very few people, but it causes long COVID in 30% of people. So really talking about death is not an issue. But let's just say that there's a virus, it's not lethal up front, but its main effects are causing all kinds of organ damage, nerve damage, brain damage, etc. Would you consider that a crisis? Because we may get to a point where there aren't any more deaths or hospitalizations. I think it's unlikely, but let's just say for the moment that it's a possibility. Where there's no more deaths or hospitalizations from COVID, but a quarter of the people infected on every surge of COVID, which probably is going to be like 3 or 4 times a year, and involving millions, tens of millions of people just in the US alone. A quarter of them are going to wind up with, various long COVID symptoms, immune dysfunction, brain damage, etc. Pacemakers needing to be installed, liver transplants in children, diabetes. Yes, getting COVID as a child predisposes you to both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I find this very interesting because those are different diseases, but COVID increases the risk of both of them. Would we consider that a crisis? Yeah, of course you would. But because we're getting somewhat away from hospitalization and death through the vaccine, which is, again, great. You don't want to die or end up in the hospital. But that's not the sole risk here. And so let's say that that link is completely broken and we get to a point where acute COVID no longer threatens your life immediately. But let's say again, a quarter of the people infected in each round suffer massive organ damage. Are we ready to call that a crisis also? Because that's what we're looking at. All right. So, speaking of kids, let's shift now. I want to talk about the pediatric liver failure issue. So, here is a news story. CDC report finds 75% of children and teens had COVID by February. Infection rates in children 17 and under skyrocketed from December through February, the Omicron spike, according to blood sample tests. This is when the US was dicking around with should we send kids to school or not, and many did. So, 3/4 of children and teens in the country had COVID by the end of the Omicron wave, BA1. Okay, so what percent of those kids are going to have long COVID, and what's it going to look like? Well, we just talked about the brain shrinkage, etc. So a lot of those kids will have suffered brain damage and immune disruption and heart damage and liver damage. So there's a very particular phenomenon. It's called COVID-19 associated hepatitis in children. It has its own acronym, CAHC. So here's a study, COVID-19 associated hepatitis in children, hepatitis again, liver inflammation, during the second wave of SARS-Coronavirus 2 infections in central India. Is it a complication or transient phenomenon? So let's read just a little bit from this study before we begin this section. I have several articles on it. So design, results, and conclusion. Design. As a retrospective and follow-up observational study, we reviewed all pediatric patients presenting to our hospital with acute hepatitis. So acute hepatitis is severe short-term liver inflammation. And of course, that can result in liver failure. So pediatric patients, of course, are children. So children presenting to the hospital with severe sudden liver inflammation. Increased number of such cases of hepatitis during the second wave of SARS-Coronavirus 2 infections, where children or adolescents developing sudden onset acute hepatitis with temporal relation to SARS-Coronavirus 2 infection. What's temporal relation? Means that they had had SARS-Coronavirus 2 recently, and without prior liver disease or familiar etiology of acute hepatitis are described. So, in other words, these children did not have prior liver disease, and they didn't have any other routes where hepatitis of this type, the acute type, normally arises. But they did recently get COVID, and that's something that they had in common. What were the results? Among the 47 pediatric patients presenting with hepatitis, 37 had features of CAHC. They had symptoms of hepatitis only, with majority having unelevated inflammatory markers and uneventful recovery following supportive treatment. Whereas the remaining 10, MISC hepatitis, this is multisystem inflammatory syndrome, and the -C again is for children. So we've covered this in a previous video. Multisystem inflammatory syndrome is exactly like it sounds. It's inflammation involving multiple systems of the body. So this is something that some children get with COVID. Anyway, the remaining 10 out of the 47 had protracted illness, multiple system involvement, and required admission to critical care with a mortality rate of 30%. 3 out of those 10 died. The conclusion, with the emergence of newer variants of concern, including the Delta variant, which has now spread to more than 60 countries, this was, of course, written in 2021, and was responsible for the massive wave of COVID-19 across India, with changing presentations, CAHC might be one of them. Such new entities need to be identified and differentiated from other emerging syndromes in children for a timely and appropriate intervention. So there was basically a wave of CAHC documented previously, and now we're seeing a rash of it following the Omicron wave here in the US. Well, do we think that maybe this is a result of all the COVID infections that we allowed in, again, 75% of the children in this country? Well, for some reason, it's shocking, it's depraved, it's desperate, but they're doing it anyway. For some reason, the medical establishment, if you will, the voices of medical officialdom in the United States, is, I shit you not, actually trying to blame this on adenovirus, which is literally like a common cold virus. So, here is a tweet from Rochelle Walensky, head of the CDC. I will remind you, she is a medical doctor and a master of public health. Do people who put out this kind of disinformation deserve to keep credentials like that? I think that they don't. Anyway, so she tweeted on May 11, today CDC Gov issued a health advisory regarding its investigation of cases of hepatitis of unknown etiology in the U.S. Etiology is origin, basically. Updated guidance for clinicians is available here. If you click that link, it does not mention COVID anywhere. It does mention adenovirus, does not mention COVID. This is a cover-up. There is basically no evidence to back up the claim that this is related to adenovirus, and let's get into that. So I'm going to start with an article from Medriva, which is linked with BNO Newsroom, which does do good reporting on COVID case statistics and things like that. Unfortunately, this article could have used some work. They at least dared to say that it was linked with COVID. But anyway, you can see some of the assertions that are being made about the links to adenovirus, and kind of this will give us a basis for understanding how flimsy these claims are when we get into some of the harder data to, question this. Nearly 300 cases. Global mysterious hepatitis outbreak linked with COVID infections amongst children spreads across 20 countries. This is by the Medriva Newsroom, May 4. According to the UK Health Security Agency, the number of children infected with hepatitis had risen to more than 140 by May 4th. Inflammation of the liver, and by the way, that's a lot of kids. That's upsetting. But inflammation of the liver is now most commonly reported in children under the age of 5, with a small percentage of children over the age of 11 also now testing positive for hepatitis. The first cases of this unusual hepatitis were discovered in children under the age of 10 in Scotland. In the United Kingdom, more than 140 cases are currently being investigated. Children under the age of 5 who get hepatitis have nausea and diarrhea first, followed by jaundice. There are now 10 children on the liver transplant waiting list in the United Kingdom, the majority of whom were added recently. Fortunately, the UK Health Security Agency has not yet reported any deaths. What is hepatitis? Hepatitis is simply an inflammation of the liver that can result in a variety of problems, including liver failure and even cancer, both of which can be fatal. The liver is one of the most important organs in the body because it is in charge of cleaning the blood of all toxins and also plays a role in metabolism and blood clotting, among other things. A variety of factors can contribute to hepatitis. The most common hepatitis virus strains are A, B, C, D, and E. These viruses spread in a variety of ways and vary in geographical presence, symptoms, some people can be asymptomatic, and severity, but they all cause hepatitis. Vaccines can aid in the prevention of some strains. Hepatitis can also be caused by certain medications, autoimmune disorders, and alcohol. In some cases, such as the case of the children, there's no known cause of the hepatitis. On the plus side, liver failure caused by hepatitis in children is unheard of. Well, used to be. Clinicians are concerned, however, because of the sudden increase in undiagnosed hepatitis among children. Following the submission of reports to the WHO, an increasing number of countries are taking precautionary measures to protect children. None of the children who have been diagnosed with hepatitis have been infected with the common hepatitis virus. They wrote tummy pain. How about stomach pain, loss of appetite, unusually tired all the time, being and feeling sick, high fever, jaundice, itchy skin, gray or pale colored feces, and dark urine are some of the most common symptoms of hepatitis. Rise of cases in the UK, Asia, and Canada. According to the UK Health Security Agency, the sudden increase in cases cannot be attributed to the common virus, hepatitis A through E, and the collected data increasingly point to the sudden increase in severe hepatitis cases linked to a cluster of viruses known as adenoviruses. So again, this claim that it's linked to a cluster of viruses known as adenoviruses, this is coming from the UK Health Security Agency. In a testing sample of 53 cases, infection with a common hepatitis-causing adenovirus was responsible for approximately 75%, or 40 cases. I think that we're going to maybe poke some holes in that later, but we'll see. Furthermore, COVID-19 was found in 16% of the investigated cases. But how hard were they looking? So we're going to get into that as well. On the plus side, the agency confirmed that there is no link to the coronavirus vaccine because none of the infected children have been immunized. So, interesting side point there is none of these kids were vaccinated. So, was this liver damage possibly, again, if this was an effect of COVID, was this perhaps because they got a more severe case because they weren't vaccinated? Because all of them were not vaccinated. So again, keep a finger in the COVID-19 found in 16% because that may be key. Israel. The 12 cases in Israel occurred in the last 4 months, with 5 being hospitalized at Shah Medical Center in Jerusalem and 7 at Schneider Children's Medical Center in Petah Tikva. 2 of the children in Schneider had liver failure, requiring doctors to perform liver transplants. The other children's conditions improved quickly after steroid treatment, and they were discharged from the hospitals. 11 of the 12 children had been infected with the coronavirus in the previous year. One hypothesis being tested is that liver inflammation is a symptom of long COVID. So they go through a few more countries. I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time to further down in the article. Adenovirus is a common virus that causes symptoms such as mild fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and colds. Most people who contract adenovirus recover without any serious complications. While adenoviruses do not usually cause hepatitis, it is still a highly complicated virus. Adenoviruses are typically passed from person to person through inhaling adenoviruses in the air and touching surfaces contaminated with the virus. And I just want to mention here, they're going to go through some hypotheses. When they say it does not normally cause hepatitis, it really normally does not. In fact, in order for it to do that, you probably have to have a pretty severely compromised immune system. So it's like kind of like anything can kill you if your immune system is weak enough. Again, not a normal thing that it's going to cause. There are several hypotheses that are currently being studied on why there has been an increase in the reporting of hepatitis among children who have contracted a severe adenovirus infection. One theory is that children are more susceptible to the virus because they have less exposure to outside air during the lockdown. Absurd. While others believe it could be an environmental, toxin, or drug exposure. Just suddenly, all at once. No. Others contend that this could be a precursor to COVID, a concurrent infection with COVID, or a completely new illness. Other possible explanations include the presence of a new strain of the adenovirus with or without the presence of the existing cofactors, and as previously stated, it may be long COVID. They just mention, and I'll read it, parents should be on the lookout for signs of hepatitis and jaundice and contact their doctors if their children exhibit mild to severe symptoms, so including mild symptoms. Common preventative measures include hand washing, good respiratory practices and hygiene, monitoring children, and if a child develops symptoms of a gastrointestinal infection, such as diarrhea and vomiting, they're advised to stay at home and not return to any kind of school or preschool until 2 days after becoming asymptomatic. So that's the sort of mysterious take on it. Let's get into some people trying to figure this out. All right, this is a tweet from April 28 from @RP Shah Memorial 1. Long thread. There's a visible effort by some quarters to steer the discussion about pediatric liver injuries away from COVID, blaming lockdowns and adenovirus. So let's recap what we already know from SARS-1 and MERS effects on the liver. So we know that liver injury can be due to direct viral replication. It can be caused by poor blood flow, hypoxia, low oxygen, caused by ventilation in the pediatric ICU, immune response, breakage of the gut vascular barrier. So what does that mean? Well, the gut is the gut. It's where food, at various stages of digestion passes through. And vascular means blood vessels. So yes, your gut is well vascularized. There's a lot of blood vessels down there. But there are barriers between the foreign matter that your body is digesting and what actually gets absorbed into the bloodstream. However, if you get stuff just going directly into the bloodstream, not through the normal channels of absorption in your digestive system, you can get all kinds of toxic stuff that your body really, it wasn't meant to go into your blood. and that can be hitting the liver and overwhelming the liver, doing damage to it. Finally, the alteration in the gut bacteria, the gut-liver axis, as well as drugs. So just to recap, liver injury can be due to 1. Direct viral replication, 2. Poor blood flow, hypoxia, 3. Ventilation in the ICU, immune response, breakage of the gut vascular barrier, and the alteration in the gut bacteria, the gut-liver axis, as well as drugs. A number of drugs, by drugs I mean any type of pharmaceutical. There's a lot with the potential to cause liver inflammation, liver injury. So those are a lot of the common routes of liver injury and inflammation. Next tweet. When you have 15% of people with raised liver function tests in SARS-1, I think it's foolhardy to try to distract attention away from hepatic issues, that's liver issues, in COVID, since SARS-1 is the closest known thing that we have, not adenovirus. So we're looking at SARS-2 right now. SARS-Coronavirus 2 is COVID-19. That's that virus. So we also had SARS-1 back in 2003, 2004. That's the closest thing that we know and have studied in relation to COVID-19. Not adenovirus. That's not the same thing there. And then there's a site with a study with some underlined lines showing that none of these patients had comorbid illnesses or had taken any medications. Next tweet. This well-done microscopic study from the SARS pandemic showed 2 out of 7 cases, which is close to 30%, to have massive necrosis in the liver and cirrhosis. To try now to blame this on lockdown is laughable. Next tweet. Another paper, this is from 2004, you can see it on the screen, said that 60%, that's like 50, 60, 70, not 15, 16, 17, 60% had liver issues with SARS. And interestingly report lymphocytic infiltration, which can be due to autoimmune hepatitis. There is apoptosis, or programmed death of liver cells, and mitosis, effort by the liver to regenerate itself, post-SARS. So, yeah, you can see the quote there underlined. Liver impairment is commonly reported in up to 60% of patients who suffer from severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. Marked accumulation of cells in mitosis was observed in 2 patients, and apoptosis was observed in all 3 patients. So, like it says, apoptosis is programmed death of cells. Cancer, for example, is unchecked growth, where apoptosis is going awry. But yeah, the liver, again, it's called severe acute respiratory syndrome because the respiratory symptoms can cause sudden death, and that's really bad. However, that's not to say it's not doing massive damage in even a majority of people. So a majority of people who had SARS, like 60%, had liver impairment and signs that the liver was damaged, trying to shut down the damaged parts and regenerate itself. So, okay, well, that's what SARS-1 did. Is it crazy to think that SARS-2 might be doing something similar? Continuing. So when does it appear? The whole gamut of problems doesn't appear initially. 24% of people had liver issues on admission to the hospital, but over the course of the hospitalizations, 69% developed the liver complications, leading to desaturation, need of ICU, and death. So again, when you read hospitalized with COVID, read severe COVID injury. A lot of these people, when they were admitted to the hospital, they weren't in that bad of shape yet. And then over the course of the hospitalization, while their body is struggling, I'm not trying to blame the hospital for this, but the infection is that bad. Before it runs its course, it does a lot of damage in a lot more people. So you can see the conclusion of that study there. Reactive hepatitis is a common complication of SARS coronavirus infection. Those patients with severe hepatitis had worse clinical outcome. So again, this is SARS-1, not SARS-2, but is it crazy to think that there might be something similar going on here? Continuing, we have always said that we need to include the fecal sampling in RT-PCR or RAT negatives. We know that this is common with Omicron. However, SARS had 41% people with virus present in the liver. To try and paint it otherwise is deliberate misinformation, otherwise known as disinformation. Most of these cases tend to be ignored in the normal clinic. However, signs of abnormal, i.e. more than 5 times SGOT, SGPT, these are liver enzymes, warrant closer attention. We know that most are mild initially and some 7 to 10% would have progressed. SARS was not alone in causing liver issues, but the chance is approximately 3 times higher. To try and brush COVID under the carpet as a cause of liver injury in children is unethical, dangerous, and deliberate misinformation. We know that with COVID, the situation is a little different. The tropism is more on the cholangiocytes, less in the liver cells directly, but often the immune issues and the endothelial dysfunction that's associated with other organs and long COVID are present. The powers that be are worried, and they understand that liver injury to kids could potentially upset the whole COVID is no issue to kids story. This lockdown theory is trying to confuse the masses. I hope that we continue countering it as well. That's the end of that thread. Let's go into a second thread about the acute liver failure. This is from Farid Jalali MD on Twitter. Farid has done quite a lot on this particular topic, and it's led to a lot of medical and public health professionals really indicting themselves by, showing their denialist or minimalist tendencies about it. So anyway, here is a detailed thread on the alarming rise in cases of acute liver failure in healthy children. Media and scientific bodies have placed undue emphasis on adenovirus infection as the leading culprit in such cases of liver failure. Let us see if this claim holds water. Short answer, no. Adenoviruses are viruses that cause self-limited respiratory, gastrointestinal, or conjunctival, that's pink eye, infection in healthy children more than adults. Severe manifestations due to adenovirus, such as acute liver failure and death, are not seen in healthy hosts who have a competent immune system. So comment, your immune system, the average healthy immune system can fight these things off. You'll get a cold, you'll get some gastrointestinal symptoms, you will get, maybe pink eye if you get it in your eye. But if you have a competent immune system, it's not like a serious risk to your life or health or anything like that. It's not going to cause organ failure or something like that. Continuing. In contrast, adenovirus can cause severe disease, acute liver failure, in hosts with severe immunodeficiency, such as organ transplant. When you get an organ transplant, you have to take immunosuppressing drugs so that your body doesn't reject the new organ, etc., or chemotherapy, things like that. That's the kind of situation where you can get severe disease, when you have severe immunodeficiency, not a healthy immune system, a suppressed immune system. Depletion of T lymphocytes is a major risk factor. Severity of disease depends on intensity and duration of immunosuppression. Adenovirus has serogroups A through G and many serotypes. Tissue tropism, that's which tissues the different types go into, differs between types, and this creates variable clinical manifestations. So if you have a serogroup or serotype that goes more towards one tissue, it's going to cause symptoms there. If you have a type that targets other kinds of tissue, it's going to create different symptoms. Type 41, being promoted as the culprit for the recent liver failure in kids, causes gastroenteritis, that's irritation of the gastrointestinal tract, but it is not associated with hepatitis. You can see there in the graphic. Infection with adenovirus is very common in children. Adenovirus is detected by PCR in up to 11% of healthy, asymptomatic children from throat samples. Pediatric tonsils and adenoids are a common reservoir for adenovirus. It's found in up to 76% of tonsils and adenoid specimens. Moreover, adenovirus is well described to persist in 30% of immunocompetent children after an initial infection for months to years, e.g. 203 days per that study that he cited. This persistence seems to decrease with age as children become adults, per another study. So what does that mean? Immunocompetent children, those are children that have a competent, healthy immune system. Adenovirus persists in about 30% of them for months to years. In other words, they're not having symptoms, but the thing is still hanging out in the body. Therefore, detection of adenovirus in pediatric throat samples by sensitive PCR-based methods, sensitive meaning they're very good at detection, does not necessarily establish the presence of a disease or causality by adenovirus. Such detection is frequently due to low-level viral persistence in tonsils and adenoids in children. So again, these two slides basically state in healthy children who have got some kind of adenovirus or more than one kind, from a cold or whatever, It persists in the bodies of 30% of healthy children for a while. Doesn't really mean anything that it's causing any disease, etc., let alone liver failure. Relying on adenovirus detection by PCR in children, often incidental due to persistence and shedding, can falsely attribute adenovirus as the cause of a disease for which the clinician may have no other proper explanation. In other words, pediatric acute liver failure in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. This issue is not new or limited to this pandemic. Over-reliance on positive PCR testing for adenovirus from the throat has led to challenges in the care of Kawasaki disease, and in cases of febrile infants, causing delayed diagnosis and treatment. Back to viral persistence, there is now clear evidence that adenovirus persists and replicates for years in the mucosal lymphocytes in children. Examples of mucosal lymphocytes implicated include those in adenoids, tonsils, and the gut mucosa. Evidence shows that in mucosal lymphocytes from adenoids and tonsils, adenovirus DNA is preserved. Adenovirus infection is persistent, and infectious virus are produced by low-level replication. High levels of adenovirus DNA in lymphocytes were found among the youngest children. Shedding of adenovirus in the stool also supports a mucosal association of adenovirus. Adenovirus DNA has been found readily in intestinal lymphocytes, T cells, ranging from a few hundred to several million copies per million cells on average. Quote, persistent gut infection with adenovirus is well documented after a mild or even an asymptomatic upper respiratory infection due to adenovirus in infants and children. In fact, up to 15% of adenovirus-infected cases were found to excrete adenovirus in the stool for periods ranging from 3 months to 1 year following the initial infection. About 1/3 of these continued to excrete virus for even longer periods. The goal of this thread thus far has been to demonstrate that 1. Adenovirus persistent in throat and stool is very common in children. 2. PCR detection of adenovirus from such reservoirs is not indicative of a disease caused by adenovirus. It's simply detection of known viral persistence in children. Now, despite the evidence presented of how commonly adenovirus can be detected via PCR as a bystander in children, bystander meaning it's just there, the child contracted it previously and it's just hanging around, let us assume that adenovirus type 41, as alleged by CDC and UK reports, is the culprit for acute liver failure in recent pediatric cases during COVID-19 pandemic. Benefit of the doubt here, thought exercise. The first order of business is to look at the existing literature and see if the CDC and UK findings match the published description of adenovirus hepatitis. There are just over 100 individual cases of adenovirus hepatitis described in the literature in the last 4 decades. The largest series was published in 2017, cite there from Stanford, and it includes a summary of all previously published cases. In this series, 12 cases of adenovirus hepatitis were identified by biopsy and autopsy specimen. This included 8 pediatric patients. All 8 pediatric patients were severely immunosuppressed. Remember what we were saying before? Adenovirus does not commonly cause hepatitis, but it can if your immune system is not working. So all 8 of these pediatric cases were severely immunosuppressed. 7 had liver transplants and 1 was receiving chemotherapy for leukemia. I will omit the adults in this case series for obvious reasons, but patterns remained the same in adults. All cases of adenovirus hepatitis in this series presented with fever. All had elevated liver enzymes, AST, ALT mean over 1500, elevated total bilirubin, mean 3.8. 63% died from organ failure, with time to death of 4 to 21 days from when the adenovirus hepatitis was diagnosed. Most importantly, 100% of the cases showed adenovirus inclusions within liver cells, hepatocytes. 100% of cases had adenovirus detected within liver cells, predominantly using immunohistochemistry. 1 case was confirmed additionally with electron microscopy. A review of 100 additional cases from previous literature showed similar patterns. 100 out of 100 were severely immunocompromised, organ transplant, chemotherapy, etc. 100 out of 100 had viral inclusions on liver histology, mostly identified by immunohistochemistry. The final dagger, Adenovirus types 2 and 5, not type 41 as found in CDC and UK reports, were the most commonly isolated adenovirus types in cases of acute liver failure, comprising 72% of such cases. No known case report of adenovirus type 41 was found to be causing acute liver failure in that search. Now, let us review the series just published today by CDC MMWR from Alabama cases labeled Acute Hepatitis and Adenovirus Infection Among Children. The misinformation begins with the label itself, sadly. In this report, 9 pediatric patients with severe hepatitis and, quote, adenovirus viremia are described, ages ranging 8 months to 5 years. Before admission, symptoms included vomiting and diarrhea, no fever reported. On admission, most had jaundice and elevated liver enzymes. After all common infectious and metabolic causes for acute liver failure were ruled out, per routine protocols, liver biopsies were performed as indicated in all such cases. This is where things get interesting, and they diverge from all published cases of adenovirus hepatitis. By the way, a biopsy is while somebody is still alive, tissue is taken for examination. Like an autopsy, but you're still alive. 6 of 9 cases had liver biopsies. Recall that among 100 plus cases of adenovirus hepatitis described in literature, 100% of biopsies found clear evidence of adenovirus inclusions in hepatocytes. In this Alabama series, 0% had adenovirus inclusions in the liver tissue. In the Alabama series published by CDC, 0 out of 6 biopsies had evidence of adenovirus on immunohistochemistry of liver tissue. 0 out of 6 biopsies had evidence of viral particles on electron microscopy of liver tissue. This is fully inconsistent with a core diagnostic pillar of adenovirus hepatitis as reviewed previously. Sadly, cidofovir, an antiviral with activity against adenovirus, was used nevertheless in 2 of the 9 cases, to not much effect as both cases required liver transplantation. Despite a complete lack of evidence of viral inclusions on liver biopsies, blood was tested, as done commonly when the cause of hepatitis remains unclear, for several viruses. 9 of 9 cases harbored adenovirus in blood. 5 of 5 blood specimens sequenced had adenovirus type 41. Recall that adenovirus is commonly present in low levels, replicating and shedding in children for months to years, and adenovirus commonly disseminates into blood in states of immunosuppression, with worse clinical manifestations in the most severely immunosuppressed. In other words, worse clinical manifestations mean you have more symptoms, it's doing more damage because your immune system is more suppressed. Acute liver failure from any cause is a state of immunosuppression, and hence it is not unexpected that persistent adenovirus may be disseminated into the bloodstream from its well-described reservoirs in the gut, as well as from the adenoid and tonsillar mucosal lymphocytes. So what does this mean? So acute liver failure from any cause is a state of immunosuppression. So basically, if your liver fails, this is important for your immune system, and that can be described as a state of immunosuppression. Your liver is a massive filter and chemistry station in your body. You need it to do all kinds of necessary transformations, and not having that is a state of immunosuppression. Once you're in that state of immunosuppression, it's not unexpected that persistent adenovirus, meaning you contracted an adenovirus at some point in the past, it was the common cold, it was bronchitis, it was pink eye, whatever, and it's still kicking around in the body but not really causing symptoms. It's hanging around. And then when your immune system goes under, it decides to resurge a little bit because there's less holding it back. So it has these, quote, well-described reservoirs in the gut, as well as the adenoid and tonsil tissue, where it sort of lives after it hangs out, but the body hasn't fully gotten rid of it yet. Well, it's hanging out, your immune system goes dormant, and it comes back a little bit. That's not surprising then to find it in the bloodstream. Continuing, this low-level reactivation and dissemination is not just a theory. In fact, the authors of the Alabama paper alluded to another virus, Epstein-Barr virus, found in the blood of 6 of the 9 children, and attributed it to low-level reactivation. That's a quote, given the Epstein-Barr virus IgM was negative. What's IgM? Immunoglobulin M. It's a type of antibody. So if you're negative for the antibody for Epstein-Barr virus, that suggests that it is an old infection. If it was a more recent infection, you would have active current antibodies against it. So this does suggest low-level reactivation of persistent Epstein-Barr virus, which basically the immune system, again, like this dormant adenovirus, has fought off, but it persists for months to years. I mean, I don't know about the case of Epstein-Barr specifically, but we were just talking about adenovirus hanging around in children for some extended period of time. But again, if the active antibodies aren't found, that suggests that the body already fought it off. The antibodies have already been recalled. Moving on to the UK report, adenovirus was the, quote, most common pathogen detected in 40 of 53 cases, unquote. However, sorely lacking in detail is the type of source from which adenovirus was detected, blood, stool, or throat. The report vaguely mentions that 11 out of the 40 adenovirus positive had adenovirus in blood, and all of these were type 41F. 10 cases were SARS-Coronavirus 2 positive. 11 cases had adenovirus viremia. So again, that just means adenovirus in blood. Viremia is when a virus is in the bloodstream. The undeserved attention to adenovirus viremia suddenly becomes more evident. In other words, 10 cases were SARS-Coronavirus 2 positive. Despite the extreme ease of checking antibodies against SARS-Coronavirus 2, this data is sorely missing from the UK report. The authors stated that a, quote, high population prevalence of SARS-Coronavirus 2 makes data interpretation challenging, okay, and therefore decided to not publish this data. Lastly, Scotland released a more transparent report from 13 pediatric cases of acute liver failure. None had any underlying immunodeficiency. Unlike published reports of adenovirus hepatitis, none had any underlying immunodeficiency, and the majority of children also had no fever. 5 of 13 cases had a recent positive test for SARS-Coronavirus 2. In stark contrast, only 1 of 13 cases was adenovirus positive by PCR in blood upon admission. The other 12 had no evidence of adenovirus in blood, once again highlighting the undeserved attention to adenovirus viremia. Echoing the CDC report of low-level reactivation in these children with acute liver failure, one child was adenovirus negative by PCR in blood on admission, but 12 days later tested positive for adenovirus in blood, as well as CMV in urine by PCR. CMV is cytomegalovirus. And lastly, one case was a 10-year-old arguing against the hypothesis put forth without evidence that isolation over the last 2 years in kids is resulting in lessened exposure to common childhood pathogens such as adenovirus, and thereby allowing more severe infections to occur now. Comment, I think that is just a wildly flimsy theory. I mean, here, again, there's no evidence for it. It's also just as a theory, extremely weak, I think. Continuing, this 10-year-old was an 8-year-old 2 years ago, before the pandemic, and the alleged strict isolation began, and therefore is expected to have had full exposure to all childhood adenovirus infections by age 8. So before all this lockdown started. I mean, such as it is, the lockdowns haven't, it's just absurd. Anyway, in summary, the evidence is weak for adenovirus being the causative agent for the recent pediatric acute liver failure cases. If a medical student used such weak reasoning in rounds, he or she would be asked to hit the books, reformulate thoughts, and come back better prepared next time. It is profoundly embarrassing that major scientific bodies in the US and UK are using such weak circumstantial evidence to distract the public's perception from the likely possibility that recent SARS-Coronavirus 2 infection may be driving the increase in cases of acute liver failure. After all, a PubMed search, PubMed is like a big database of medical health-related studies, does not yield any result on adenovirus type 41 causing acute liver failure, much less any adenovirus type causing any acute liver failure in healthy children. However, it does show SARS-Coronavirus 2 doing exactly that in a healthy child. See there, case report, fatal acute liver failure with giant cell transformation in a pediatric patient associated with MISC. We talked about MISC before, and again, go back to the studies from India, etc. So we do have evidence of this, and we have evidence of SARS-1 doing lots of liver damage in many, many cases. So again, it seems like a distraction, the adenovirus thing. It's not well supported by the evidence and just as a theory kind of weak in the first place. So it took me several days. I mean, I was collecting these articles for weeks. It took me several days to actually put together the specific video, though. And since I started the video, the BioBot site that does the COVID-19 wastewater monitoring graphs has updated their site as of May 18. So what do we see? The curve has ticked up even more sharply, and it's now officially at the peak. You know, it's the same level overall of COVID-19 that is being shed from people's bodies into monitored wastewater as the Delta peak about 8 months ago, as last winter's peak, as the initial peak before the lockdown started in spring 2020. It's back up to that level. So in another week or two, it will be second only to the Omicron curve. It will have surpassed all the three largest peaks before that. Is this the world you want? Is this the future you want? It's not the future that I want. So what happens when we just let it rip? Well, so far we've been getting a virus that is more severe. Delta, for example, was like 5 times more capable of causing severe disease than earlier strains. And then Omicron was maybe 90% as severe, like slightly less severe than Delta, still way more severe than the original. Because now you got to account for vaccines and things like that. People's immune systems are different. It's still capable of causing a significant amount of disease, though, but it's becoming more and more contagious. So the severity has been stepped up dramatically, and now what we keep seeing, whether it's Omicron, BA2, some of the BA2 offshoots, BA4, etc., each one is like 25% more transmissible, more contagious, basically, than the previous one. So it's getting more and more contagious. But what else can happen? Well, here's a study, and this is the last medical study I'm going to do in this video. The title is A Mouse-Adapted SARS-Coronavirus Causes Disease and Mortality in BALB Mice. So I'll spare you all the details, but I will read you the summary. By the way, I am opposed to animal testing where it is at all avoidable. It's not a pleasant thing, and I feel like sometimes doing these COVID updates, we discuss studies that involve animal testing, and I don't want to just sort of casually, discuss what is oftentimes very cruel research. So just want to put that out there. But getting back to the study, what they did was they had these BALB mice, which are commonly used in lab tests, and they took the Urbani strain of the SARS coronavirus, SARS-1. This is the one from the mid-2000s. And they purposely passed the virus over 15 generations. What was the result? Let's read. No single animal model for severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, reproduces all aspects of the human disease. Young inbred mice support SARS coronavirus replication in the respiratory tract and are available in sufficient numbers for statistical evaluation. They're relatively inexpensive and easily accessible, but their use in SARS research is limited because they do not develop illness following infection. In other words, the virus does replicate in the respiratory tract, but they don't get sick. That's the young ones. Older, 12 to 14-month-old BALB mice do develop clinical illness and pneumonia, but they can be hard to procure, and immune senescence complicates pathogenesis studies. Immune senescence, well, senescence is aging, basically, so immune aging complicates pathogenesis or generation of illness studies. We adapted the SARS coronavirus, Urbani strain, by serial passage in the respiratory tract of young BALB mice. 15 passages resulted in a virus, they're calling MA15, that is lethal for mice following intranasal inoculation. So what? So they took this virus and they gave it to the mice, and then they took it back out of the mice after it had replicated in the mice. Then they took that mouse processed virus, if you will, and gave it to other mice. So that is serial passage. After they did this 15 times, this virus, which in young mice does not cause disease, and in older mice it does develop, illness and pneumonia, it became fatal following intranasal, that's in the nose, inoculation. Lethality is preceded by rapid and high-titer viral replication in lungs, viremia, and dissemination of virus to extrapulmonary sites, that's sites outside the lung. And how? Because it's viremia, it's in the blood, so it's circulating to all kinds of tissue. And that's not necessarily the case with regular SARS coronavirus. Again, they say that it replicates in the respiratory tract, but this, the MA15 strain that they produced is, it causes fatality preceded by rapid, high-titer viral replication in the lungs, spreads to the bloodstream, and disseminates to sites outside the lungs, accompanied by lymphopenia. This is reduced white blood cells. Neutrophilia, that is an elevated number of neutrophils, which is a type of immune cell, and pathological changes in the lungs. Abundant viral antigen is extensively distributed in bronchial epithelial cells and alveolar pneumocytes. The alveolar pneumocytes, that sounds complicated. That's the part of your lung where gas exchange takes place. It's a type of cell. There's actually two types of them, and they do a couple other things, but that's kind of the main thing. Also, the bronchial epithelial cells, the bronchi, are the tubes that carry air into and out of your lungs. Epithelium is basically lining, so the lining of your windpipe is the bronchial epithelial cells. So basically, the viral antigen, just meaning the virus, is extensively distributed in the lining of the windpipe and also the stuff of the lungs, the alveolar pneumocytes. And necrotic, that is dead, cellular debris, is present in airways and alveoli, with only mild and focal pneumonitis. We'll come back to that again. These observations suggest that mice infected with MA15, the fatal one, die from an overwhelming viral infection with extensive virally mediated, that is, the virus is, causing or overseeing the destruction of pneumocytes and ciliated epithelial cells. If you remember, cilia are the little hairs that sweep, dust particles and whatever else you inhale out of the windpipe. So ciliated epithelial cells, again, the epithelium is the lining. So this is sort of the lining that has the cilia, the little hairs that sweep things away. So the overwhelming viral infection causes destruction of pneumocytes. This is basically how you breathe, and the ciliated epithelial cells. There is only, however, mild and focal, not like rampant and pervasive pneumonitis. This is basically just lung inflammation. The MA15 virus has 6 coding mutations associated with adaptation and increased virulence when introduced into a recombinant SARS coronavirus. These mutations result in a highly virulent and lethal virus, RMA15. R means recombinant, duplicating the phenotype or actual physical expression of the biologically derived MA15 virus. So, what does that mean? So, the virus, the MA15 that they created through this serial passage over 15 generations, they wound up with 6 coding mutations that are associated with adaptation and increased virulence or ability to cause disease. So they introduced these into a recombinant, engineered version of the coronavirus, thereby duplicating the results that they got out of this experiment. And that product is called RMA15. Again, functionally equivalent to the thing that was produced from the serial passage, just basically a version that they create and control. So intranasal oculation with MA15 reproduces many aspects of disease seen in severe human cases of SARS. The availability of the MA15 virus will enhance the use of the mouse model for SARS because infection with MA15 causes morbidity, mortality, and pulmonary pathology. The virus will be of value as a stringent challenge in evaluation of the efficacy of vaccines and antivirals. So if you're running trials for vaccines and antivirals, this virus will really put them to the test, in other words. So they weren't in this study, that's the end of the summary, they weren't in this study trying to prove anything about mutation or severity of disease. They were just trying to come up with a version of the SARS coronavirus that would allow for mouse studies that would be more comparable to the kinds of disease that's seen in human beings. Because again, just using the plain, wild, off-the-shelf SARS coronavirus, it does replicate in the mice, but it doesn't really cause human-type symptoms. But they were able to achieve that by making a virus that was significantly more prone to causing all of that sort of lung damage in the mice that it didn't naturally cause. How? Just by letting it rip. Serial passage 15 times. So they wound up with 6 mutations, which increased the virulence, and there you go. So we went from a virus that didn't really cause enough symptoms to one that was fatal in the mice. That's what you get when you let coronavirus rip, or you can get anyway. You know, every time that a virus replicates, there's the potential for random mutation through error or through recombination. If the host is infected with more than one strain at a time, and the virus can do that, you wind up, viruses really like this. They're just strings of genetic material encapsulated in a somewhat durable shell. And they just drift around looking to reproduce, and, you get mutations. And so they found in this that they were able in just 15 generations to wind up with a fatal virus. Hope I've made the point. I know I've repeated it several times, but I hope that that's clear. This is just what happens, and we've been seeing it in the pandemic. If you just let it rip, it mutates, and guess what? It definitely can get stronger and has been getting stronger. It's gotten more severe in terms of the disease it can cause, and it's gotten much more transmissible. And how? Well, it's just in position, 312, this amino acid changes to this amino acid. And sometimes that doesn't mean anything. Sometimes it even weakens the virus. But sometimes it helps the virus to fend off an antibody. It can make it, it can change the shape of the virus, or even the polar charge, the way that the molecules are arranged in terms of the overall charge of the virus. It can make it just harder for an antibody to bind. It can make it easier for the virus to enter a cell, etc., etc., etc. And that's what happens. It's got nothing but time. It just drifts around and it replicates, and oop, there's an error. Hey, let's try it. It just runs. It's mindless. It just does this. It's just a force of nature. It just does this. It's mindless. So you can't reason with it. Nothing else. All you can do is stop transmission. So again, if, over serial transmission, 15 generations, they created this much more virulent strain in the mice. Well, how could they have stopped that? Well, if they had not done that. I mean, in this case, they were trying to do it, and it was under controlled laboratory conditions. But the point is, they achieved it through transmission, i.e. replication of the virus, and they wound up with some mutations. And some of those mutations, 6 of them, were associated, that they knew of, with advantage to the virus. This is how it happens. I know I've been repeating this a lot. I can't emphasize it enough. So, what's actually being done in the United States? To wrap it up, I've got 2 other pieces, and then we're done. Politico article by Adam Cankren, May 13. White House prepares to ration vaccines as COVID funding impasse looms. The government's funds are running out. Tough decisions may soon present themselves. Sounds great. Literally the exact opposite of what needs to be happening is happening. And I feel like that is becoming pretty much the theme across all of politics right now. All the people who are out there, oh, we're going to pull Biden left. Fuck you. You haven't done shit. This is a complete lie. And we're fucked. Like, we're in a bad position now. Among the sacrifices being weighed are limiting access to its next generation of vaccines to only the highest risk Americans. Great. A painful and foreboding reality is setting in for the White House as it enters a potentially dangerous stretch of the COVID fight. It may soon need to run its sprawling, pandemic response on a shoestring budget. just 2 months after the administration unveiled a nearly 100-page roadmap out of the crisis. Doubts are growing about Congress's willingness to fund the nation's fight. Comment. Again, this is way too rosy a picture. They're giving the White House way too much credit for this. This is the same White House that enthusiastically rolled out mask or vax last year. That crippled the pandemic response by undercutting the amount of people wearing masks, which, yes, you have to force people to wear masks. Also, a lot of people just get confused and they're like, oh, I guess it's safe now. And that didn't even need a budget, because it's not like they were supplying masks to people. They really weren't. I mean, they should have been, still should be. There should be an N95 mask mandate, and they should be given to people for free, period. And we need to go back to a better situation with the testing, not these stupid rapid tests. So we've already seen Biden, undercutting the pandemic response substantially, even when the budget wasn't involved. Now, this year, the added factor is things also aren't getting funded. Continuing. It has forced Biden officials. Oh, and by the way, who are some of these Biden officials? Look up a video we did on the channel called Fire Jeff Zients. Zients. Just search on that. This is Biden's COVID czar. Where is he from? Some great public health agency? No. He has no public health experience or medical experience or biology experience or really any science experience at all. He comes from Bain Capital, the corporate rating firm that Mitt Romney also came from and that Obama basically ran against in 2012. That's who's been making the final call on a lot of the White House COVID policy. And, the Democratic Party is just owned by big capital. That's just unfortunately the reality people need to face, and the U.S. left needs to ditch the Democratic Party and organize a workers' party. The Green Party would be an obvious next step since it already exists in all 50 states. It just needs to be built. People need to get involved, etc. If people want it to be something else, great. Although, again, the Green Party is right there. If you want it easier, just start with what's already right in front of you. But people aren't even doing that. Anyway, not enough people anyway. People are doing it, and I see you doing it. But we need much bigger numbers, and people need to stop complaining and get involved. This idea that the perfect organization or party is going to drop in your lap is just wrong. You have to build it. That's what actual workers' democracy is about, not having things handed down from on high. You have to actually build it. But anyway, that's White House policy. In a good cop, bad cop scenario, both the good cop and the bad cop work for the same people, and they both serve the same purpose, trying to bust you. Continuing, it has forced Biden officials to debate deep cuts to their COVID operation and to game out ways to keep the federal effort afloat on a month-by-month basis. Among the sacrifices being weighed are limiting access to its next generation of vaccines to only the highest risk Americans, a rationing that would have been unthinkable just a year ago when the White House touted the development and widespread availability of vaccines as the clearest way out of the pandemic. Comment again, we need to stop transmission. Vaccines are great for if there are serious measures to stop transmission, mask mandates, etc., to prevent people from contracting COVID. That's good. And then you have the vaccine as a backup plan. But it's not just, oh, get a vaccine and act like everything's normal. That's exactly what you don't want to do. Just because you're wearing your seatbelt in your car doesn't mean it's okay to start driving drunk. But as the government's cash reserves dwindle, officials are increasingly concluding that these types of difficult choices will soon have to be made, and they are quietly preparing to shift responsibility for other key parts of the pandemic response to the private sector. Of course, where, profit is king and people can make a buck off of it as early as 2023. Quote, there's a great deal of concern that we're going to be caught short-handed, said one person familiar with the discussions. On the face of it, it's absurd. I couldn't agree more. The contingency planning is aimed at preserving the bare minimum tools needed to protect against the virus this year, federal officials and others familiar with the discussion said. But many of those decisions still hinge on Congress authorizing $10 billion in new COVID spending, a prospect that remains uncertain in the face of GOP opposition. Senate Republicans have stalled the funding request for weeks over demands that they first get an unrelated vote on President Joe Biden's decision to end COVID-era border restrictions. Despite Biden administration warnings that the U.S. could record 100 million more infections through the fall and winter, some GOP lawmakers comment, same GOP that, by the way, just voted in Congress against producing more baby formula during a national shortage. Yes, that's how much they care about health and, of course, the lives of children, are also separately skeptical that there's an urgent need for more money. Okay, accusing the administration of failing to account for the hundreds of billions of dollars it has already spent. Should the Senate manage to break its impasse, people familiar with the planning said that the funding would only still be enough to keep the government's core COVID activities running. Nearly half that amount would immediately go toward paying the administration's debt to drug company Pfizer, which has yet to be fully compensated for supplying 20 million doses of its antiviral treatment, Paxlovid, earlier this year. The roughly $5 billion remaining would likely be split among investments to bolster supplies of tests, treatments, and vaccines. Under a best-case scenario, the administration might make those stockpiles last through the end of the year. Even then, the White House's ability to react to a dangerous new variant would be severely limited, and funding to aid the global response would be non-existent. But at worst, the people said, the richest country in the world could find itself out of money to combat a COVID resurgence on its own soil. And let's upgrade that to the richest country in the history of the world. Quote, all that needs to happen is to have a variant emerge that's highly infectious and causes more morbidity and mortality, and we're back to ground zero, said George Benjamin, executive director of the American Public Health Association, which represents public health workers. Quote, we have not finished the job. The stubborn difficulty in providing new funding for the emergency response has cast a pall over the administration. Yeah, that and a lot of other things, where officials view Biden's ability to keep COVID under control as essential to the success of his presidency. Comment there, if you look at average polling on Biden's basic favorability, it started to tank right around the time of Delta, and it has stayed underwater since then. The White House in recent months sought credit for effectively ending the crisis. What? Touting its vaccination campaign and widespread distribution of tests and therapeutics as key to allowing most U.S. Americans to safely resume their everyday lives. Watch out for long COVID, though. They're not going to say that. Yet the administration has struggled simultaneously to make the case for pouring continued resources to fight the pandemic, with officials surprised by the level of Republican resistance and unwilling to hold up other legislative initiatives to use them as vehicles for getting COVID funding passed. The White House's initial $22.5 billion request was cut to $15.5 billion in March, but that allocation fell apart after House Democrats objected to paying for it by clawing back COVID funds from individual states. Republicans further whittled down the deal to $10 billion and demanded a separate immigration vote. Biden and fellow Democrats sought to put the funding in a larger Ukraine aid package, but they decided this week to decouple the two, and no clear strategy remains for breaking the stalemate. By the way, $40 billion to weapons in Ukraine. They could have ended homelessness twice over in the United States. They passed that, and they can't even pass COVID, let alone all of the other urgent problems. They don't fucking give a shit about working people. Yes, on many of these votes, you will get more Democrats voting for the good stuff, whatever it is. However, when it comes down to it, they work hand in glove with the Republicans in everything essential to maintaining empire. Everything essential to maintaining the system, in effect, in keeping the Republican Party around. As the saying goes, if U.S. politics were for real, one party would do universal health care and wipe the other one off the map. The Democratic Party could team up with the left and enact a broad slate of popular reforms. This would shatter the Republican Party and send it into the dustbin of history permanently. However, what then happens? Then the contest shifts to being between the Democrats and the left, with the Republicans out of the picture. So the people who own both the Democratic and Republican parties don't want that to happen, because the left then would be, which is not owned by Wall Street, would be in danger of putting the Democrats out of business, and then what's Wall Street supposed to do? So that's why we're perpetually in this situation, is because the Democrats are paid to stand down, They're owned by the people who also own the Republicans, and they're prevented from ever effectively fighting against the Republicans, and they're paid to oppose the people, the left, who actually would effectively oppose the Republicans. So they claim that they're the opposition, blah, blah, blah. They actually stand in the way of effective opposition. That's why we're perpetually in the state. That's why Roe v. Wade is now about to be overturned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why we're in this position. Without the money to keep its COVID operations running, Biden allies say they now fear a resurgence of the virus in the summer or fall could wipe out the gains the president has staked his health record on. And by the way, fuck his fucking health record. People are dying and getting sick and getting injured. This isn't just some political abstraction, and could plunge the country back into crisis just ahead of the midterms. The selfishness, it's astounding. Anyway, quote, inaction in Congress is already forcing difficult and unnecessary compromises that have dire consequences for the American people, a White House spokesperson said, adding that failing to authorize additional funding would force, quote, even more difficult trade-offs. Let's just say what it is, just a shittier situation, period. It's not difficult trade-offs like, this whole shared sacrifice thing. There's no shared sacrifice. We have a class system where the rich, they don't share anything. They make out okay, and costs are just externalized onto the working class. Biden officials have stressed to lawmakers that securing funding now is critical to the administration's preparedness later this year, particularly when it comes to purchasing new vaccines meant to better target Omicron variants. The government can't commit to purchasing them until it has the money, sparking concerns that competing countries will get first access to the limited supply, or that the U.S. will only be able to afford enough shots for the highest risk populations. And of course, as we've covered, they're going to define down who is the highest risk. Obviously, it's more elderly people and things like that, but many, many, many more people are also at risk of, either acute COVID or the long COVID. There's no need for any of this. The money is there. They just won't hand it out. And I say money, obviously we're in a money-driven, profit-oriented system. The technology is there. The equipment is there. In a socialist, producing for use type of context, not producing things as commodities, but just producing them because people need them for use. This could easily be done. But, the entire for-profit, private, market-driven stuff, that's really what is gumming up this entire thing. More immediately, the administration is holding off investing in the manufacturing of potential new COVID treatments, people familiar with the matter said. So this also gets into the thing of holding on to the intellectual property rights so that we can't vaccinate the whole world, etc. For the party of science, the Democrats, in capitalism, science does not rule. Science is constrained by capital. And if you actually believe in science, if you're a scientist, whatever, you should not be a libertarian, you should not be conservative, because you're propping up a political system that absolutely constrains science to a just unfathomable degree. Really, any kind of capitalism is going to do that, where, the quarterly profits come before everything else. So that includes the Democratic Party, really any type of liberalism. Moving to socialism is how to actually unchain science. Biden officials originally planned to aid the development of a pair of antiviral pills that could expand the government's arsenal of treatments that cut the risk of severe illness during the acute phase in infected patients. Instead, that money has now been withheld in case it's needed for more urgent priorities. So, again, this in the context of the CDC's, as we covered in previous portions of the update, the CDC's switch from the community transmission map to the community risk map, where everything's green all the time, pretty much, unless something is, actively on fire. And even then, it's probably going to be green. As long as you have open hospital beds, everything is, cleared for takeoff. This is what's actually going on behind the scenes. Things aren't getting funded. Treatments, that could keep beating back the virus and, making a more well-rounded, robust response. None of this is happening. And meanwhile, in the public health world, which is, responsible for all these communications to the public about what's going on, it's like, hey, everything's great. It's so many bad things coming together at the same time. Within the administration, the funding stalemate has also prompted fresh deliberations over the long-term viability of the COVID response. While the White House has publicly maintained that it needs at least $22.5 billion from Congress overall this year, there's internal acknowledgement that getting anything beyond the initial $10 billion investment is a long shot. Quote, "They've never suggested that $10 billion would last very long," said Senator Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri, who met last week with the White House COVID coordinator Ashish Shah on the issue. Quote, "But $10 billion may be the most that there's any appetite for right now." Again, what is the Republican Party doing? Well, we have a Florida MAGA judge, Mizell, Trump appointee, who was rated incompetent by the American Bar Association, basically making a ruling that the CDC doing anything, including mandating masks on public transportation, is unconstitutional. It's not within the not that it's not within the mandate, although I think that was part of her reasoning, but that either it's not within the purview of the CDC as chartered by Congress, or that Congress was violating the Constitution by giving it that authority. Can't remember which off the top of my head. But these are the kind of fundamental attacks that the Republican Party is doing on the ability for there to be anything but just sheer market anarchy. Should that worry you? Yes. In fact, I just put up in the community posts, they're doing the same thing to the SEC that regulates Wall Street, that basically the SEC can't fine people anymore, that it has to take them to a jury trial. That just came out yesterday. Insane stuff. It's basically, who is making these decisions at this point. If you've seen that libertarian debate where Gary Johnson got booed for suggesting that driver's licenses might be an acceptable thing, and there was that guy next to him going, "What's next? A permit to make toast in your own damn toaster?" That guy is basically making policy for the United States right now. On a private call with health experts last Thursday, Shah said some lawmakers have floated winding down the federal subsidies that guarantee free COVID vaccines and treatments to all Americans, instead suggesting that private insurers take over the process. The White House doesn't view that as an immediate option. Well, thank heaven for small favors, due to how complex and disruptive it would be for U.S. Americans and the health system. But other administration officials in recent weeks have weighed the prospect of transitioning responsibility for vaccines and some treatments to the traditional clusterfuck of an insurance market as early as next year, two people familiar with the matter said, spurred by the realization that the government may soon have no other choice. So again, all the we're going to push Biden left people, I said at the time, no, he's going to pull you right. Who was correct here, me or you? Have the Democrats been rallying people on these points or really anything? No, of course they haven't. The whole thing is just such a sham. It's just the emperor is wearing no clothes. The Democratic Party stands for fucking nothing but the big capitalists that own them. The shift would be complicated and fraught and take months to engineer, the people said, and no decisions have been made. There's also widespread recognition that such a move could represent a setback for the White House's much-touted pledge to ensure an equitable response by making it harder for low-income and uninsured people to access and afford vaccines and treatments. You think? Biden ran on a public option. He opposed Medicare for all, but he had a public option on his website. He never mentioned it once, but it was on his website. Again, they don't stand for anything. They don't help working people. They're not even close to the bare minimum. Quote, "It's really concerning that 2+ years into a global pandemic, we're still needing to have these arguments on how best to protect people," said Chrissy Giuliano, executive director of the Big Cities Health Coalition, which represents metropolitan health departments. Quote, "The people who will be impacted the most are the most vulnerable." Yep, that's capitalism. Hoping to break the impasse, Shah and other top officials, including senior Biden advisor Steve Ricchetti, have met with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to walk through the looming consequence of not passing additional COVID funding. Among outside allies, there's greater discussion of enlisting governors and prominent health coalitions to call for action on the funds. Yet with little ability left to force Senate Republicans' hand, there's growing fear that perhaps the only way to keep the COVID response alive will be for COVID itself to swamp the nation in infections once again. Well, comment, we just had that with Omicron. And what happened literally as soon as the curve started coming back down to like the Delta level? Oh, everything's over. COVID's probably over for good. Blah, 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 blah. That narrative has been just running roughshod over the public since Omicron. And again, what do we see in the wastewater? We see the same level of surge that we saw in Delta and last winter, etc., but the cases aren't getting reported. We're in the cover-up phase. Swamping the nation in infections once again, I mean, it's going to happen, but will there be a different response? People have to get organized and force one. It's the only way we're going to get it. Quote, we need to decide as a country how we want to deal with the fact that COVID's going to be with us for a long time, said Bob Kocher, who served on the Obama administration's National Economic Council. Quote, the path we are perhaps unintentionally choosing, oh really, leads to a more disruptive, longer, and more economically painful COVID experience for America. End of article. So, even the Bank of England, I was showing in a recent live stream, has found that the number of people out of the workforce due to illness is at the highest in 30 years. And for some demographics, for women, it's the highest that it's been in even longer than that. So this is crippling the system. People are becoming disabled for a year or more. And, they've only had it for a year. It may go on for 5 years for all we know. Significant impairment from COVID that leads to people not being able to go into the workplace. Also think about it. Let's say you get COVID and you have a horrible experience, you develop long COVID, really pronounced symptoms. I mean, there's the effects of that, but there's also the psychological trauma of do you want to set foot back in the place where that happened? Of course not. So last thing I'm going to close with, what is Biden doing? This tweet is from May 13, 2022. We need to fund the police with the resources and training they need to protect our communities. Literally, crime is fucking lower when there aren't cops. Cops cause crime, but this is the priorities that the Democratic Party is putting out, leading with. That's why we designed the American Rescue Plan, not only to beat the pandemic and rebuild our economy, neither of which is happening, but to restore public safety. What? So NBC News, President Biden will urge states and cities to use unspent money from last year's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package to fund crime prevention programs and hire police officers. Hey, do you have spare money lying around? Give it to the fucking pigs. Yeah, give it to those departments which are already full of military, tanks and shit like that, from basically military surplus that they're giving to random rural police departments, and also the police departments that are full of ex-soldiers that have been trained to kick down people's doors in other countries and murder children. They are now staffing the police forces as well. Also, the overall U.S. police force, if it were a military, would be the third largest military in the world. Graphic on the screen. This is from 2019. The U.S., of course, has the largest military in the world by far, by budget, $731 billion, then followed by China at roughly 1/3 of that. And then U.S. police comes in behind China and well ahead of India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, UK, Japan, and South Korea. This is what we've got, and people are sitting around and not getting organized? No, go get organized now.